Welcome, everyone. It's 6 o'clock, so we will call the meeting to order. The Committee of the Whole for Thursday, September 14th, 2023, to be dealing with the draft infrastructure master plan. So first, we need an adoption of the agenda. Do I have a mover to adopt the agenda as presented? Councillor Broderick, Councillor Parks, all in favor? Motion is carried. At this time, I'd like to mention that Deputy Mayor Nathan Townend has sent his regrets for this evening's meeting. He's unable to attend, and I believe Councillor Willis is just going to be a little bit late joining us. So is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest or the general nature thereof this evening? Being none, we will move right into the main topic for this evening, the draft infrastructure master plan, and I'll turn it over to staff to share the information with everyone.
Perfect. Thank you, Your Worship. So we're just going to ask Ms. Chapman to share the presentation. Okay, so good. So good evening, members of council. We're pleased to do this presentation this evening to provide council an update of the infrastructure master plan. First, I'd like to introduce the presenters this evening. So we have at the end of the table, Luke McDonald, who's the engineering and environment manager, also co-lead on this project. We have Madison Lockwood, who's our project coordinator. And we have David Thompson, who's our chief engineer, special project. And Dave is the lead on this project, and myself. This project was done mostly with internal resources, with some components which were assigned to external consultants. So in addition to the presenters this evening, I wish to acknowledge the presence of operations managers and directors involved in this project, and also each of their respective team. It is truly a project that involves every aspect of municipal operations. Before we get started, we tend to use a lot of acronyms or technical terms throughout the presentation. So we provided a list of these acronyms in the presentation, but you also have a printout of it. So please use as you need to, and if you need some explanation, we'd be happy to explain. After reviewing the meeting objectives, Dave will provide an overview of the infrastructure master plan process. Then Maddie will walk us through the growth projections used for this project. Dave will come back to us with the background and proposed plan projects for stormwater and transportation. Then we will take a short break. Luke will go over the proposed plans for our water and sanitary infrastructure, and Dave will cover the miscellaneous items. And at last, we will provide next steps and take further questions or comments. So there will be a question period after each part, so you don't have to hold your questions till the very end. There's also a lot of information. We do realize there's a lot of information to cover. There is a lot of information in the report, and it will be a long presentation. But if we don't get to all the questions tonight, staff will remain available afterwards for further discussions. And it is not anticipated that council will be asked to endorse the IMP, the Infrastructure Master Plan, until February 2024. So there's a lot of time to revisit some of the items being presented tonight. Okay. So the objective of this presentation is to provide an overview of the Infrastructure Master Plan project. Since the project was started during the previous term of council, we felt important to review what a master plan exercise is. And after presenting the anticipated growth within Loyalist Township for the IMP period, we're going to discuss some specific projects proposed for each of the infrastructure category listed, being stormwater, transportation, water, sanitary, and miscellaneous items. That would all be outlined. And the most important objective is to receive general feedback from you regarding the presented projects and the initiatives, the priorities. Okay, Dave, your turn.
Be back in front of council. It's been a little while, a little rusty, but here we go. So what is an IMP? Well, first of all, it's a flexible document. It's primarily what I would call a technical planning exercise to ensure that the necessary infrastructure is in place when needed. The results of the study form one of the main building blocks for establishing impost fees and development charge studies down the road. So it's an important revenue, or which are important revenue sources for our growth related expenses. It's also an important tool to attain the physical objectives of the strategic plan. The province allows considerable flexibility for master plan scopes. It provides a framework for operations when replacing equipment and designing project schedules. Master plans often include master plans include usually mostly major projects or projects that have significant environmental impacts. Sometimes they're limited to one type of infrastructure, such as transportation or wastewater. And if I use an example, the last master plan that Loyalist did was completed was the Loyalist East Sewage Project in about 2004. And that outlined improvements to the MSU wastewater plant, decommissioning of Odessa and the pipelines and the pumping stations, made it all work, sort of thing. So that gives you an idea of the scope of things. And again, it provided the framework and got ourselves in place for funding and got the work done, sort of thing. So that's the general concept of how things are to work. Staff examined some of the master plans that have been recently completed. Several were online and we looked at them. And at that time, Jenna was a co-lead of the project, and we favored what we saw with the City of Ottawa as an example. And the reason we liked the City of Ottawa is it covered all of the City of Ottawa's infrastructure. And it also included a section on policy development and best practices that supported infrastructure. And we thought that was a good approach to take, sort of thing. So in short, our document covers both those major projects that I mentioned before that legally require the full evaluation, but also includes some of the smaller projects in the policy content. Okay, next slide, please. Volume's okay. Just Okay, so as just mentioned, some of the projects in our master plan are subject to MCA requirements. We used a 25-year planning horizon, and we're completing the study in accordance with the municipal class EA assessment requirements. And just word of note, I might say municipal class EA, or I might say EA, it's the same thing. And just my brain doesn't separate it sometimes. So if you hear those terms and wondering why I said something different, I was just leaning to the right, that's all. Loyalist Township is required under regulation of the Environmental Protection Act to complete EAs for specified projects. Projects that must follow the MCA process are typically larger projects. There are projects in our master plan documents such as intersection signage, evaluation, and sidewalk construction that do not require full MCA evaluation. So again, some of the smaller projects we don't need to do. We've taken a messy chart that you would find in the MCA document and simplified it for this presentation so that you can get an idea of various steps of the Class EA with the phases. So first of all, the master plan process includes phase 1 and phase 2 only. Phase 1 includes public consultation and identification of any problems. Phase 2 includes agency, Indigenous, and public consultation, and includes an evaluation of impacts to the environment. EA considers, sorry, that's my note here, so I need to expand on this. So when we're talking about environment tonight, we're talking about broad, the meaning has a broad sense, and I use the legal terms when they say broad. So we're not just talking about ecological impacts. We're talking about essentially any impact, whether it's noise, whether it's financial, you name it, it's there sort of thing. So it's quite a broad thing. If anybody was around in the windmill days and saw the types of comments that came out of that, that's a good example of what broad environmental scope means. So we're taking a look at that on several of our projects. We've gone ahead and got archaeological and ecological work done on it or completed. The last step of phase 2 is to prepare a draft report for public, Indigenous, and agency comments, which is submitted to the ministry. We're at that stage now. In the next coming month or two, we'll be about 98 to 99% done that. Complete that. Next slide, please. We're there. Okay, so this slide, first of all, just by regulation, the municipal class EA applies only to water, sanitary, stormwater, and transportation infrastructure. And anything else outside of that doesn't apply. So we quite often people say, well, what about a park, or what about the municipal office expansion or something of that nature? Those features or infrastructure are covered by the Planning Act. Sometimes maybe the Planning Act doesn't even apply to them, but again, by regulation, Class EA only applies to these infrastructure. You'll see on the end of the top row, there's a little graphic there for miscellaneous. We had a few items, and I'll use an example, a snow dump that didn't quite fit any of those other 4 squarely. That's a round peg in a square hole sort of thing. So we've added a little category miscellaneous to pick up a few items that we wanted to, topics that we came across. The other thing in developing the master plan is what do we talk about? And through the discussions of getting the master plan sort of framed out how we would approach it, we came up with the idea of using themes. And the biggest theme for Loyalist Township, obviously I think for everybody, is growth. And that is the driver of most projects. So when I'm talking what's driving a project, we're always referring back to that theme. So we had regulatory, technology change, climate change, and remedial needs. So staff have evaluated all infrastructure in the township under this category and developed technical memorandums outlining any expected needs over the 25-year planning period. Where beneficial, external consultants have participated. All technical memorandums have been reviewed by operational staff. The township will issue an IMP draft report, which will be a summary of all the topics discussed based on the themes outlined above. The file copy of the IMP, which will also be provided to the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, I'm going to say MECP going forward, will include all supporting documentation and available upon request. And typically that'll be a digital document, but if somebody really wants to sit down, there'll be a paper copy in the office somewhere. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned earlier, our IMP will include discussions on new regulations and policies. And again, it's not a necessary component, but we thought it was a value added. When we're going through all this information anyway, we might as well pick up any flaws that we see. Staff decided to review policies when it's felt that a review would support infrastructure and operational needs, and good policies support planning processes and coordination across the township. Simply, everybody's rowing in the same direction. Follow the slide. So I'll follow the slide. So what are we not looking at? I'm going to go through the first one slowly. Life cycle replacements of assets covered by the municipal's capital asset management plan are not included. So what does that mean? If we've got a 40-year-old road that needs repaving, and at the end of the day, it's going to be repaved and nothing else is happening, that's a capital asset replacement. It's not on our list. We're looking at bigger, better, or new to the township. That's the best way I can explain it, is bigger, better, and new. So use another example. Main Street, Odessa's got a 12-inch or 300 millimeter water main. You guys are my age, or approaching it, so let's call it a 12-inch water main. Next time through, it might, sorry, not a 12-inch, it's a 10-inch. It's a 10-inch, sorry. Next time through, pardon me. Next time through, it'll be a 12-inch water main, if that's what's being proposed. So because it's bigger, that moves it in classification. We're clear on that because that's an important thing for this whole discussion. Okay. Rural roads, that's been an issue, an ongoing issue since I arrived 20-some years ago. Public Works has been working on a rural roads improvement program, looking at rural road surfaces and drainage and that sort of thing. That started at the same time as the IMP, and we just decided we'd let that process go its separate way, and the IMP would go its own. Transit and ferry are both eligible topics within the municipal Class EA process. Because of all the things that were going on with MTO and out of our hands, and all the recent improvements to the ferry docks, and the review of the transit system for accessible transit and other things that are happening in the system, we thought there's too much at play with those portfolios to work into our thing. So we stepped aside on those. Landfill issues are not in the MCA. That's a standalone, separate environmental assessment. And as I mentioned earlier, facilities are approved under the Planning Act. So buildings and that sort of thing. There is some overlap, but I'm not going to get into that with our time frame. So role of council, that's you guys. Tonight, your role is basically to hear what we have to say. And if you have any afterthoughts, we'd be pleased to receive them. And Ms. Merritt is here at your beck and call to coordinate that. So that's the second line item in that slide, is provide feedback. And following completion of the IMP, this is when council's role steps up. You're going to have to look at the broad list of recommendations and decide which ones are most important to the municipality and support them with budget and resources, whatever that may be. So questions on just the intro?
Councillor Prodrick.
Through your worship, just one sort of general question there, Mr. Thompson. You mentioned Indigenous consultation, and then in the next sentence you said, or comments. So are they consulted at this point, or are they consulted sort of after what you're presenting tonight?
That's a good question. So as part of the process, the township issued a notice of commencement. And that, in our case, the notice of commencement listed a preliminary list of projects that we anticipated we'd have. There's projects like Amherst Drive and the Windermere Roundabout that have been stewing about for quite a while that we knew about. So things like that were put onto a list that was sent out to our Indigenous contacts. And for each time you issue a notice of commencement, the ministry has staff that provide us with a list of Indigenous contacts, and they change, just the same as our politicians change. Those people, pardon me, those people change too. So it was updated just for interest's sake. The last time I did one about 4 years ago, we had 2 or 3 Indigenous contacts, and that list was up to 7 now, I think. So it's a timely, there's a lot of change in that whole process. So essentially every time that we felt that we need to do an archaeological review, we provided notice. We've actually had a few Indigenous representatives on site for, well, at least for one of them, but they were invited to participate in all of them. And there's been various steps along the way that we've invited them along, sort of like. So they will get a draft document shortly. There's also another stage right now. It's new to the MCA process was amended in March 2023, and there's an interim stage that we're recommending that I guess we're going to do it. We're not recommending it, but involves an additional Indigenous notification saying that we want to follow the 2023 rules, that these are the rules of today, as opposed to the rules that when we started in 2020. So, and that's just a new thing, but that'll give an additional Indigenous contact here shortly.
I can just follow up. So it's fair to say then you've done your due diligence, and the other party may or may not respond. That doesn't slow down the process. In today's environment, I won't say, but we have done everything we can. And I would say that based on my understanding is a lack of response by any party doesn't look favorably when the ministry is looking at something. But when you're dealing with Indigenous and treaty rights, that's a matter in itself.
Any other questions? Councillor Ennis.
Thank you. Just on development charges, could you just explain a little bit more detail how, once this process is complete, how it will feed into the development charge process?
The quick, smart answer is we'll give them the book. That being said, I won't be around to be involved, but typically you would take that book and sit down with a consultant and go through it. And we're, as we're putting this together, we're always talking about how do we get that information front and center. This is a growth element. So Maddie's she's got a great chart here that's going to tell us all that. She's not going to tell you tonight, but it will. But there's a lot of work at that stage, and I have not looked at the recent changes in the development charges, so I don't even want to comment on it. But based on the old part, the way it used to work, we have a good understanding how it used to work. So we've written the reports in that way, and our consultant will be able to tell us, okay, either you meet the new or you don't. And when they do their study, they'll pick that up. But they'll have a list of each project, the cost of the project, and we'll be able to provide them with the growth percentage charts that either our consultants have or what the staff is, and they can tell us if we're out to lunch or whether that's a reasonable approach. That's usually how it works.
So if I can add as well, is the same answer for the imposed fees. right? So we'll take the list of water and wastewater projects, and it will inform the impost fee study.
Yeah, and I would just add the impost study is coming due based on a 5-year renewal cycle. So you'll see in the upcoming budget that we'll be carrying an impost study for 2024 to renew that. So this is excellent timing in terms of completing the IMP and rolling the water and sewer projects right into a new impost study.
Go ahead if you have something. No, okay. Any other questions at this time? I may be jumping ahead if it's in the next steps, but this is a 25-year plan. So are we regulated to when it needs to be reviewed, or is it at our discretion?
On the master plan, I would say there's no regulated time frame. I would suggest it's probably just good practice to maybe look at in 5 years' time, or if some other, if there's a major change in then the scenarios. You got me, Jim, on this one, or through there. But in the old rules, up to March 2023, after 10 years, a project, like if you thought you had a project approved, it had a 10-year life until you started it. And starting was really gray language. You've been in construction, so it could mean starting construction. It could be doing a formal survey or buying some property. That described construction. It didn't necessarily have to have a crane on site. But tell you the truth, I would have to look into the amendment and just see what that looks like today. But
Okay.
I think it's still there.
Doesn't have a bearing on tonight. It was just, I was curious because of so many of our plans have timeframes for renewal or review. So, okay, good. Before we move on, any further questions? Councillor Proctor.
This is just a general, sorry, excuse me, through your worship, just a general question. This presentation, does it follow the report chronologically? Like I've read the report and made a bunch of notes, but I want to make sure we're sort of in, is that the way the report is? Do they sort of, yeah, okay. Okay, thank you.
I don't know if everybody heard that, but we swapped the location of the transportation and stormwater and moved it up and moved the water and sewer down. That was for our old guys to make it through.
Okay, if there's no further questions, please proceed.
So throughout this project, growth projections have been used to help staff determine when infrastructure projects would be required within the IMP study period. So in 2019, next slide. In 2019, Hempson conducted a growth study for the township, and they developed a reference scenario that projected how growth was expected to continue out to 2046. That can be seen here on the slide, with the blue showing population, the yellow being the number of dwellings, and orange being employment. Their reference scenario projected that the township would experience moderate growth throughout this time period, and that housing would likely be outpacing population growth. In 2021, staff calculated the actual number of dwellings that the township had experienced between 2016 and 2021. And this was done using the number of building permits that had been issued in each study area. The calculated growth was compared to the projections from Hempson with their 2021 number. And then the difference between these two values was used to determine if the growth scenario would need to be revised before we used it in the IMP. As shown in the final column of this table, the projected and actual values for Amherst were quite similar. In Odessa, our calculated values were significantly higher than projected. In Bath, they were lower than projected, and in rural areas of the township, they were slightly higher. So based on these observations, it was determined that the growth scenario for Amherst could be maintained, whereas the scenario for Odessa, Bath, and Amherst was revised to be a high growth scenario. For Odessa and rural areas of the township, a revised high growth scenario was used due to the numbers that were seen in 2021, which were higher than initially projected. For Bath, although we saw lower growth than projected, the amount of servicing that had been completed in that area recently by developers suggested that a high growth scenario would still be suitable. This table on the slide shows the difference between the projected number of dwellings with the original scenario from Hempstead and then the revised high growth scenario that we developed for use through the IMP. So these figures also show the difference between the two growth scenarios. As you can see in Amherst, they are the same, whereas in the other three locations of the township, the revised high growth scenario shows an increased number of dwellings, which is based on the observed growth. It should be noted that these growth projections are all based on data up to 2021. However, staff have continued to monitor growth so that we can track if any of these will need to be adjusted. So in general, the projections that the township have used have been accurate to date. We used observed growth to make some adjustments, and we developed these revised growth scenarios that I explained. It should also be noted that there are some years where there's higher growth than other years, but typically over a long study period, such as what we have with the IMP, this will balance out. The revised high growth scenarios were able to tell us the number of dwellings, but we also wanted to make projections for population. So we did that using the assumption of 2.5 residents per household. And you can see the corresponding population projections on the slide. So the table shows that with the revised high growth scenario, the township population would be around 26,000 in 2046. And the figure shows how that breaks down in the 4 areas of the township. Any questions?
Through you, your worship. Just a question on one of the first charts you mentioned. It says, I'll just make sure I read it verbatim. So that's the first Hampson 2019 on page 64. It says, housing projected to outpace population growth.
Mhm.
And yet, I guess we're led to believe there's no housing in a sense. So can you sort of, I guess, make sense of that for me?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. So that comment is intended to reflect that we're anticipating to have dwellings increasing faster than the number of population growth, which reflects aging population, reducing the number of persons per household. So young families, you might have 3-4 people in a household. An older couple, there's only 2. So as couples in older neighborhoods start to age, the population per household is reducing.
Follow up your worship. So in a sense, I guess we could say it's a generational shift that causes, maybe the single dwelling house is now a 2-family house, or however, the different logistics change. And just on the one chart around page 13, I think it is, was on the one. So some of those charts give where the, let me just find one here. So revised growth scenarios. So where those lines cross the yellow line, at least in Odessa and Amherst, basically that's when we're at full capacity, in a sense that we're either run out of space or run out of like new building lots, I guess, as opposed to reconfiguration of places that may be there.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. So the yellow lines on these graphs represent the number of dwellings after build out of committed units. So these are units that are already planned within our through the planning process. So they've received draft plan approval or something of that nature. So that's the number of units reflected in say the future Lakeside Ponds developments or the Odessa West Babcock Mills developments that are under construction in various phases.
If I could just follow up. So basically those are the lots today. It doesn't mean, for example, in Odessa, there may not be future lots down the road. It's just what we're projecting as of today with all, the water, sewer, all that stuff.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, that's correct. And when we get to the water and sewer section, we'll be touching a bit more on the growth projections there and how that impacts plants.
Councillor Willis.
Through the chair. Amherst Island and mainland rural being combined, I'm wondering if it's possible to separate the two of those and if there's value in that. I'm specifically thinking forward to if future development happens. The island has limited capacity because of the ferry. And I know in the past, there were limitations on building permits and things like that. And we've got some pretty major infrastructure projects planned. So is it possible to have that data separated so that we can see that? Or do you not have that ability?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So it would be possible to split that out. I guess I would just note that, again, the ferry is not a part of this analysis. And so when we're looking at these projections, we're primarily focusing on the transportation, water and sewer side, which there wasn't any severe limitations. So there at the time, it wasn't deemed beneficial. If that information is of interest to council, we can certainly provide it.
Through the chair, thank you. Even though the ferry is not part of this study, it is always a consideration. So I think that it would be good to see those projections for separated out. I may not understand fully. Correct.
What we can do is we'll take that comment back and take a look at the information and see if where it makes sense to make the separation.
Any other questions on this portion? Seeing none, please carry on.
Mr. Mayor, I was thinking about your question before on the lifeline of the IMP. And I think when my cohort Luke gets to water and sewer, if you all pay attention to the amount of work that's deemed to be required to meet the growth needs in about 10 to 20 years time frame, you're going to see a lot of stuff there. So from what I'm seeing and what we've talked about, it's going to be very important to keep this process up so that your inability to get the funds either through impulse fees or development charges as you can and stay on top, know that you're on track on this stuff. So probably doing this process again formally in 5-7 years is going to be worthwhile so you can substantiate what those charges are, sort of thing. So.
Thank you. Almost more of a living document.
So I got to get focused on this part now. So we're here to talk about stormwater. And stormwater infrastructure has two purposes. So everybody is aware of public and property safety concerns. And as staff, we're treating those as paramount. The secondary objective, and one that's come to light more so in our lifetimes, is maintaining water quality in the natural environment. So in my meetings in the past with the Ministry of Environment over the last few years, every meeting time we went, there was a policy person there from the ministry saying how they want to tighten things up. And the only reason they haven't tightened it up is because of there's no money to do it all the time. And I'm going to say to council, there's probably no money to do it at our end, but it's a question that we're asking the council. We don't expect an answer, but as staff, we're treating water quality as a secondary concern. And I don't mean that we're ignoring it, but we're suggesting that when we address water quality, will be the same time as we do other road work or street rehabilitation and that sort of thing. We'll look at the scenarios that are there and address at that time. We figure that's the best bang for the buck, as opposed to going out and putting in storm sewers and storm scepters and all those good things that make better water quality. Obviously, all the new subdivision work, everything is all done to current standards. That's not the issue. It's the old issue. When I say old, pre-1980s construction, pre-1990, somewhere in there is where the break point is in Loyalist. So again, I'll leave that with you. Is everything we're saying, we're not highlighting stormwater quality as high as perhaps other places might. So we have a little bit different approach in stormwater than the other types of infrastructure, in that instead of looking basically at growth, we kind of analyze the systems that we have. And as engineers, we always qualify everything. So we have two terms here in front of you: minor systems and major systems. So a minor system is a system designed for a relatively frequent storm. And a simple explanation is no significant impacts in ditches or pipes after a storm. And under our current design standards, a minor storm is an event that has a probability of occurring once in 5 years without causing any backups. That's a high level explanation, but that's basically what it's designed for. Anything within 5-year storm, our new system should take it away. Prior to about the 1990s, we had a 2-year storm. So any of the older parts of Amersfoort, some of the eastern end of Bath, that would have been probably the standard of the day sort of thing. So what that means is, you know, if most of those areas are open ditches and that sort of thing, those ditches and everything should function fine for the biggest storm that you'd see in like the probable 2-year storm sort of thing, or 1 and 2 year storm. I haven't got that right, but know where I'm going. And I guess the important thing for members of council is the older communities. So things before, you know, the 1960s, mid 70s, weren't really designed, engineered at all. It basically relied on getting a ditch in front of the house. And if that was there, then that's the case. Many of those areas, and I'm talking half of Odessa and half of the older area of Bath, have never been fully evaluated. So to quantify on paper, we can't tell you if these areas are fully resilient or not. All we have is our anecdotal, you know, what happened, you know, that storm last year that hit, you know, that sort of thing. And luckily, you know, when we had those storms, we've addressed them over time, and there's not very many places left. The places that are left, we're going to talk about now. Not yet, sorry, soon. One of the requirements that the ministry asks when you're doing an EA is to make sure you provide climate impact assessments to your work. And obviously, precipitation is one of those hot items in climate change. We've had the summer from hell, as everybody knows. So from the ICLEI climate review that Loyalist Township completed about 3-4 years ago with Jenna and friends, for climate, one of the things that were noticed was increased precipitation, more frequent events, and increased intensity of rainfall. So when we were doing our review, we looked at all of those things, both on a minor storm and a major storm level. And another thing we did was we took all of the engineered storm systems, all the areas with storm pipes, and put a big model back together just to look at what that looks like, you know. And there's about 30-40 years of data on that, and we ran that through, and for the most part there was no problem with the engineered stuff. We didn't evaluate the ditches. We didn't have the manpower or the resources to do the older areas, but that's a project that's going to be recommended. And we also looked at the storm systems, and the storm systems, fortunately, were also turned out okay, as well as the stormwater facilities have reasonable outlets. So in terms of handling the major storm, the 100-year storm, we feel confident that those systems are in place right now. Next slide, please. I've kind of covered some of these topics here. I'm going to just skip that one quickly. So we're moving on to a list of minor system, I'm going to call them problem areas that have been pointed out either by operations staff or you know, knowledge over the years that, you know, these are things that we need to look at. And I'm not going to go through each one. Some of these vary from like very minor, 1 or 2 days would rectify it in the field sort of thing to whole streets being addressed. While we're looking at this slide, this is going to recur through the presentation. You'll see in the upper right corner, reconstruction projects in red. Sometimes in that block, you'll see new project, I think is the language. What that means when we have reconstruction project is we're proposing that these issues here, we're not saying they're the highest priority things. When it's in the reconstruction project, it means that when that area comes up for fixing, rehabilitation, that sort of thing, we would work those improvements in there. There's a few exceptions to that, but generally what that means, if it's on that list, if it says new project, that means it's a standalone project that basically, the will of council will dictate when those projects get done. And yeah, we won't worry about that. So next slide, you're on it. Yep. Okay. So I mentioned major flows. We are in pretty good shape. It's not to say that there's nothing out there that's ever going to bother us, but over time we have history with the locations written on this point or on this slide, and what we're recommending is that we keep watching those places. If I use some examples here quickly, Emerald 40-foot, it floods every spring, and we have to go out there for a week or so and close the road for its low volume. It does provide a little bit of misfortune for a few people, but it's understood and accommodated sort of thing. One of the issues we had trouble with was Nicholson Point Road. With all the large housing in there, they've really affected the runoff from the whole area. We've looked for people to provide us an outlet. Nobody's coming forward. It's not really a township issue. We're not flooded. The road's not flooded. These guys are getting flooded out because they built big houses on big lots. And so I would have liked to have had a project in here, but without putting a hammer down, that's the only way it's going to happen, sort of thing. So I'll leave that one with you guys. The next slide. The one water quality project that we're suggesting is not really a project, but it's something that council can do. If I had a map of Amherst in front of me, you'd find that most of the central area of Amherst, and I'm going from the old nunnery convent westerly to almost to Spears Boulevard, all drains to an outlet at near the Lakeview Park or the Lakeview Sewage Pumping Station, just east of Helen Henderson. Sorry, it's not Helen, east of Briargate. And when our staff was looking at what we could do in terms of water quality and looking at that system in particular, he said that's the township's biggest water quality risk. It's providing the biggest load of pollutants to the water. It's also in this Fairfield source water protection zone. So lots of things to think about on it. It was recommended that we take a look at preserving the real estate that's there at the end of that pipe for a future stormwater facility. And that would be a pond of some sort. It's a little bit undersized, maybe a lot undersized for a pond, but a pond there would be probably the best bang for the buck. So one of the recommendations in this study is to hang on to that property for that purpose. Not that the township's going to get rid of a park, but to recognize that need down the road. We're not recommending the project within this time period, but regulatory things may change. Okay, next slide, please. Municipal drains. So as we were talking about stormwater around the table, we realized we hadn't talked about municipal drains, and that may be a foreign topic to some of you, but the township actually has 4 municipal drains. And municipal drains are not covered by the municipal class environmental assessment. They're covered by the Drainage Act, a whole separate standalone procedure, very powerful piece of legislation. The main issue with municipal drains, or one of the main topics, is the cost of maintenance of the drain and any cost of improvements is shared by the benefiting landowners. And that can be a contentious process in itself. So looking at it, I was aware of the Charters drain and the Holly Creighton drain in the southeast corner of the township vaguely. I knew generally where they were, but we never did anything with them. And as I'm doing my homework here on this study, I realized the municipality has a liability on these drains if there's a problem there. You know, if there was ever, not that we're going to have a major flood on any of them because it's flat ground, but if there was a problem there, the municipality could be liable. So, you know, the first recommendations coming out is we should be getting a drain inspector in there, certified drain inspector, and having that completed. The second thing is, to the best of my knowledge, there's not a lot of agriculture in that area. Lafarge, I think, owns a lot of that property now, and the gas plant and other owners on the Napanee side. So there may not be the interest to maintain the drain anymore, and maybe it could be abandoned. And, you know, the land would return more to its natural course. So that's just two things to look at down the road. And just the last thing is the Charters drain is partially in Napanee, so we would require the cooperation of Napanee. Next slide, please. The other issue that came up was sort of late in the process is I realized we hadn't talked about the dams in the township. So there's 3 dams on Millhaven Creek. The Babcock Mill Dam is just upstream of the dam. Structurally, it's getting long in the tooth sort of thing. The use of the dam was discontinued about 15 years ago. We actually did an EA, and Weir was recommended to replace it. There was no funding for it. The project sat. In the meantime, the mill was deemed a heritage structure, and some of the works on the site. With the timelines there, that's going to have to be re-looked at. It's a little bit complicated with the frazzle ice issue that happens in between that dam and Main Street. The old Wilton Road Dam is owned by CRCA. It's being evaluated as we speak, and we expect that there will be costs that the municipality is fully responsible for to do some update on that. And there's another little dam that's fallen down, Potter's Dam, just north of Main Street, that may help with the frazzle ice issue too, sort of thing. So I just highlighting that, you know, those will be topics that we discussed a little bit. So questions on stormwater?
Council, any questions on this? Councilor Broderick.
Through you, your worship, just Mr. Thompson, can we go back to the whole municipal drains thing? So I guess what was the original purpose of it? And is there any financial implications to the township giving up jurisdiction, or however you want to word it, of these dams? Or of the drain?
The Drainage Act is pretty prescriptive on anything you do, but so there's a process there, but my understanding would be the municipality's financial involvement would only be whatever costs were assessed to the municipality's property. So if we had a road allowance, for example, crossing one of those drains, and that was part of the area that was being drained, then that would go into the calculation. That would be relatively minimal, knowing the area of these things. Why they were built was to assist the rural community to ensure that their fields were dry when they needed to get on them and perform the activities they had to do. If you were anywhere but all the limestone plain around here, if you went to east, you know, farther eastern Ontario or to southern Ontario, the drains are pretty popular. They're pretty important features of those communities because the whole livelihood of the communities depends on agriculture. We don't see that today here with, and I should say that everywhere, but there's pockets and if you look at that, I didn't mention the Miller Drain to give it up because there is good farmland on the island that depends on that drain functioning. So
Follow up through your worship. So in effect, the drain, let's say on the mainland, no longer provides a farming function, given that I think you mentioned Lafarge maybe on. So are the drains, I guess physically, there could be a drain, but we don't own the property. Is that fair to say?
sorry, that's normally the case. I'm thinking of of all the drains that I'm familiar with, the only property we would own is the road allowance if it crosses it. And I just want to say it's anecdotal that there's not that much farming out there. I've been through some of those areas, but I've never walked. I know approximately where the drain is located, but I haven't actually got out and walked it. The Miller Drain, I've traveled most of that. But.
Councillor Boudreau.
Through you, sir, for Mr. Thompson. I know we never want to give up any parkland, and like you said, it's a result of the change in structures in Nicholson Point, but have we looked at the park for possible usage of drainage? I know it'll lead into possibly parkland to help out the residents there, even though the problem is, like you said, part of the change in structures on Nicholson Point.
I'm not quite sure, Councillor Budrick, you've started out with.
For drainage, just to alleviate, like you said, you couldn't find any property owner that would give up their land to help accommodate a drain or drainage. Have we looked at the property we own there at all?
Oh, sorry, were you referring to a Nicholson Point?
Yes, sorry, yes, it was.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with the sound system. So I would say that I'm recollecting about 6 or 7 individuals coming to the office over the years from that area requesting assistance. And it would always be after what I'm going to call the 10-year storm or the 15-year storm, and they got flooded out. And my response to them was always, if you provide us an easement, we'll fund a pipe or put, whatever it takes to get it in there to get an outlet. I'm not sure if we ever shot the elevations around the park, but I don't think that was an area where the problem occurred. There's a series of little hollows along the road, and if you're the owner of the property that's downstream from one of those hollows, you're the person that's getting that water, and your neighbors are not even aware probably. So that offer's been out there. It's been out there in writing to a few individuals, and nobody stepped forward.
Any other questions on this chapter? Councillor Parks.
Thank you, Your Worship, to Mr. Thompson. Just a quick question on the dam maintenance. The Old Wilton Dam, you had mentioned that's through CR Rockaway Conservation Authority. Their shared costs, is there not with any of that maintenance, if I remember correctly from some of the other reports that we've received on the dams?
Keep moving this away. There you go. Yes, that one is always a brain twister because we don't own the dam. But the way their funding model works is that the benefiting municipality is responsible for those costs. So based on their assessment that they're doing right now, they will come back with potentially a series of upgrades that have to happen, and we will have to fund that somehow. Now, part of the levy that they collect every year, there is a small portion of it that goes into a reserve. But when we spoke with the director of the general manager of the CRCA, it's a very small amount. Like for the how extensive those repairs could be, there's not enough funds being put aside. So the one thing as a municipality that we have not been looking at is actually recognizing the dams as assets. They're not municipal owned assets, but they're assets that we are financially responsible for. So when we get that report back for the old Wilton Dam, there's something that we're working with CRCA. We are definitely going to be working on some sort of a asset management plan for these structures.
Yes, carry on.
Just to clarify something for me, benefiting municipality is downstream? Is that how that's determined?
Yes. Again, if I go back to, so that Old Wilton Dam was originally constructed in order to make sure that the old Odessa water treatment plant had enough water around its intake. But what happened when wherever they installed that dam upstream of it, kind of expanded the area a little bit, created some habitat, create some recreational also abilities for residents. And all of this benefiting is part of Lourdes Township.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you.
So upstream and downstream.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none. Can I just clarify between the dams? I was picturing the old Wilton Road Dam, the one just north of Main Street in Odessa, where the park is. But it sounds like that's the County Road 6 dam then, is it?
That's correct.
Okay,
Just north of the on-ramp.
okay. Okay, I was picturing the one closer to the downstream. Okay,
Potter's Dam is the name of the old one that used to be just north of Main Street. If you looked over the side of the bridge, you still see the couple posts sticking up there.
yes, that's the one I was thinking. Okay, I wanted to make sure I was looking at the right one. One other, it's not so much a question, but a comment, I guess. Back a number of years ago, well, we had a winter where we had a lot of frazzle ice and there was flooding. And after that, we looked at possible ways of mitigating it. And there was a option that came to council that was there was a line across the creek with floats on it and everything to try and break it up so that the frazzle couldn't develop from bottom up. And I wasn't sure, for some reason we didn't proceed, and I can't remember if it was because it was deemed not feasible or if it was because we were working in the water. There was, for some reason, if we didn't proceed, and I can't remember what that was, but that may still be an option. And if anybody remembers that and can answer it.
I remember it well. The problem we had was, I guess it was original research by an ex-conservation authority, a staff person. And there was only one or two other examples that were encountered, sort of thing. Like, obviously it's a Canada problem or northern US, and this individual had found one or two examples in the northern states. But I won't say super pricey, but pricey enough. And if things backfired and you flooded somebody out because of a system that didn't work as expected, then there was some big risk to it. And that's probably why it didn't proceed. The other thought was that if we could maintain, or the other line of thought was if the area is frozen and has that ice cover over the whole reach the way it did historically, the water can get underneath and it doesn't form that frazzle ice. And again, this is relatively new science and stuff, but that was why I was looking at the Weir, because the Weir offered that possibility. But there's other options out there, and again, have to look at them all.
That does ring a bell, what you said about the boom, and also explains my other question about using the dams to control the frazzle ice. So thank you.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. So I just note also that we are partnering with a researcher from RMC who's studying the frazzle ice issue. This isn't a part of the IMP. It's been an ongoing study for a number of years. And so we are hoping to get some results from that study starting next year. Obviously, we'll have to see what it says, but I just wanted to note that as relevant.
Thank you. So any further questions? Seeing none, please proceed.
A wise owl has told me that if you want to follow in the text, we're starting on page 34.
Sorry. We should have said that. before water. I'm sorry.
Okay, so we're moving on to transportation. And I must say, when we originally started looking at transportation, and I put up my hand to do it, I thought this is going to be easy because growth is on county roads and on MTO roads, and our local streets won't see it other than maybe Amherst Drive and a couple others. So that's why I raised my hand and took that section. But when we put out our notice of commencement and did our communications with the public, we quickly realized that the public had a lot of comments on transportation, and our mailbox was filled with comments on traffic calming and active transportation. So from that, we did some surveys that I'll talk about a little bit more, but it's just a little leading into it. So the scope of transportation, again, we look at all of the projects we look at the 5 themes and screen all the projects through that. When I talk about roads, I'm talking about fence line to fence line. If it's got sidewalk, street lights, not the underground piping, but anything that you'd see on the road, that's a road for this discussion. Bridges, signage, and administrative improvements. We look at the whole gamut. We ended up looking at active transportation in quite a bit of detail, sidewalk evaluations, trails, paths, and I might use either of those latter terms, trails, paths, or multi-use paths. For tonight's discussion, they mean the same thing. Other days, they may mean something different. But and the other issue we looked at was traffic calming. In the slide, I also noted what wasn't included, and touched on these a little bit before. The rural roads, new roads, which are, I'll call them local roads and new developments, which developers typically would pay for. They're not included. I mentioned the county MTO roads, ferry and transit. The scope on active transportation and traffic calming really increased. We ended up spending pretty well a summer looking at all the stuff by the time we got into it. We had a summer student a few years ago that helped us through. Okay, the next slide is remedial work there. Yep. So this is one of those terms that everybody knows what remedial means, but in this case, we're talking about addressing what we're perceiving as a need in an existing area. And if a simple example is we might have an older area in one of the older subdivisions that when it was built, it didn't have sidewalks. And we look at, the whole community's going around it, and you've got a population there that, if anybody has to go anywhere, they're all walking on the one street that gets you from A to B. And it's quite a heavy traffic load. If you look at the level of service provided in the rest community, a street of that nature would have a sidewalk on it. So a remedial need in that case is putting a sidewalk into that area. This gets gray, but just taking out an old sidewalk and putting in a new one because it's worn out, that's not the remedial we're talking about. I always use the words new, bigger, and better. I think I mentioned that before. I'll say it again. Next slide, please. So under remedial work, we looked at roads, bridges, signage, road allowance, administrative improvements, drainage, and sidewalks. And again, MTO and county roads are not our jurisdiction. So, we're very aware of what they're doing, but we're not talking about it. With one exception, and that's Odessa Main Street. everybody in this room is certainly aware of the importance of that artery through the community. And over time, there's been lots of issues noted, primarily drainage. Some of the active transportation issues, specifically along the County Road 6 area where there's minimal sidewalk, the crossings aren't in place. There's no sidewalks on the north side of the road for a good length of the community. The sidewalk ends just east of this building. All sorts of deficiencies that anywhere else they wouldn't be, sort of thing is. So we've listed all of those things. The county's planning a multi-year project starting, I believe, next year, moving from the west end generally to the east end. And hopefully in that time frame, we can address most of those deficiencies. One of the things that came up was in terms of active transportation, if we're ever going to get a proper bike path or a trail or anything through Odessa, the obvious route is Main Street. But when you look at Main Street, it's a difficult animal to tackle that way. So we didn't, as much as we'd like to have made a strong recommendation on what that design or cross section might be, we held back just there was just too many irons in the fire, sort of thing. I didn't mention the Potter Street, Durham, West Street. I think most of council is probably aware of that, but there's a project. The first project will be looking at those intersections and upgrading them. County handles the costs on all the road work, sidewalks, and any underground would be the township's expense. The other main road we looked at was Bath Main Street. So we've got a lot of comments on traffic calming needs on that. And I understand from Lori, there was some recent requests for pedestrian crossings. We've walked it several times and realized there's no sidewalks on the south side, and you've got the whole Rena Edgewood community is built up and the Pies development in the 1980s. Not well serviced in terms of crossings or east to west traffic. So we're recommending some, I'll call it urbanization improvements, sidewalks, and where need be, putting sewers in to take the water if we run out of real estate to keep the ditches. Luckily, the township got the connecting link agreement this year, so a lot of that design is already in gear. But it'd be a relatively expensive project, some of which is eligible for growth charges. And the Windermere intersection will tie into that. And why I'm on Windermere, it's a collector road. And we're looking at both a roundabout or signals at that location. And each of them have their merits and each of them have their distractions. So that's still a kind of an outstanding feature. That's it for that. So next slide, please. So moving on to bridges. First of all, we use the 2022 OSIM inspection report. So that's a mandatory bridge inspection report that the municipality has to do every 2 years. And this past year, the 2022 study, as part of the work, there was an extra assignment for the development of a detailed asset management plan for those structures with the biggest needs. Before I forget, for this discussion, even a steel culvert, if it's bigger than 3 meters in diameter, it's a bridge. So sometimes I'll be mentioning culverts in bridges in the same sentence, and that's why. The report has identified 4 bridges for rehabilitation over the next few years. They're listed there at the top. And it's also listed 3 bridge replacements. One is fairly shortcoming, Wing Road. And the other 2 are probably late in the IMP process, and that's Thorpe Road and 3rd Concession. One of the reasons if I use the traditional sense of remedial, you might ask, why are these on the project? Because we're just fixing them. And I'll just give a short answer, is because the MCA says so. They have a special little section on bridges that says if you're over 40 years old, you move up to the next level of full assessment sort of thing. There's some ways around that, but that's why they're on the list initially here. And if we can press the right buttons to get them down to a Schedule A or pre-approved project, we're going to try that, but they're here for now. These projects, again, the top 4 there are over the next 3 to 5 years, I would say. I don't have the numbers right in my head here, unfortunately, but if we move to the next slide. Me too. What's going on here? What did I do here? Sorry. There. When I go back to the MCA definition of remedial and bigger and better new, the report noted that there was 6 or 7 structures that needed railing updates. And just to be clarified, the railings are as good as the day they went out there. The standards have changed for those structures, and that's why the engineer has made the comments they have. Our approach to that at the moment is those railings will suffice until other needs come on, that structure needs to be replaced. So, over time, those will get addressed, and probably by the time those are addressed, there'll be 7 more from new changes. But the bottom of the page, there's some large culverts, and to tell you the truth, I can't remember if these are 3 meters or not, but that will have to be replaced farther along in the planning period. Okay, next slide. It's not working for me. Okay. Yeah, there we are. So we're getting to the, again, you find all sorts of things under the pillow when you start looking, and through looking at some of the issues related to traffic calming and everything like that, we realized, boy, we have some strange signage configurations in the township. And I'll throw one example out there, is Havergal, and it has no signage at all at the intersections. And there's about 800 vehicles a day go through that. And, if we look at one of our rural roads, we might have a stop sign, at the end of a very quiet concession. So little consistency. And I think what's happened is, over time, as the community grew, the no signage thing may have been adequate at the time. But it's one of those things that got missed over the years. And it's quite broad when I look at the rural roads and that sort of thing, when we went through it all, once it came to light. So we're recommending that, a detailed study go through and look at all the intersections, decide on the level of service. There's a fair amount of latitude of what signage you can use in terms of yield sign, stop signage. I hesitate to say no signage, but that's a possibility in some cases. But deciding what's the appropriate signage to use, and then standardize that throughout the township and update the bylaws and all that sort of thing that go with it. Kind of similarly on the speed signs, on the mainland, a few of the older people might remember that Ernestown Township changed all the rural roads to 60 kilometers an hour, but on the island, they're still legally 80 kilometers an hour for most locations, sort of thing. So they can stay that way. It's not wrong, but consistency. The one thing that I had a concern about with the island is the change to end loading ferry allows large vehicles to go around the island, and I don't believe there's been any sort of firm analysis on whether all those roads and turns can make it for those large vehicles, and that's combined with the speed issue for those vehicles on those roads. So kind of the same issue sort of thing. So those 2 studies are recommended. Next slide, please.
On the same light, the administrative improvements, I've just listed them there. I'm not going to read them all out, but essentially with amalgamation, everything that happened, a lot of these things have never been updated since that time. Between the technological changes, traffic volume changes and all that sort of thing, there's a need to really look at these. In my time, we've had different individuals involved and they've started and got to a certain point, but it's a multi-year process. And I think the township really needs to put some resources towards that. That's not somebody involved in operations. They need to be familiar with operations, but they need to be outside of the daily weather report and be able to do their own thing, get this stuff looked at. Okay, next slide, please. And let's be that close. Oh, yes. We're going to start active transportation. So I mentioned that this became quite a topical discussion at the beginning. And what we ended up doing in the end was looking at the remedial sidewalk needs in terms of the current accessibility standards. We also looked at pathway development opportunities. There was a lot of comments on, let's call it, active transportation, outdoor recreation sort of thing, passive, for not everybody's a football player or a hockey player sort of thing. New sidewalks to connect communities, improve safety, and a policy review to facilitate active transportation. And I can say that I was a co-writer of the old policy, the current policy sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. That's the wrong. I'm just going to skip that comment because it's coming later. I'm going to go back to that map. Sorry. I got myself confused. So I'm going to use this map just to talk about generally about what the various map legend are for the next 4 maps. And then I'll talk briefly on the specifics of the rural one. So you'll see around the circumference of Amherst Island and along the north shore of Lake Ontario and up the Millhaven Creek alignment, there's some black and white little dots. Those, and also there's a similar one from Parrots Bay up to Lost Lake in the southeast corner above Amherst. Those particular routes are all outlined in the official plan right now. And we've simply, where they applied, we put them over onto the map. So you'll see that black and white line show up. One variance from that black and white dotted line is from Odessa up to Yarker, and that's on the northeast corner of the map. That's actually a new proposal, and I'm going to call it, the north end of that is Empty Road. And it shows us, it's basically a conceptual route from Odessa to Yarker, and you're going to say, why Yarker? The goal is to make a connection to the Cataract Way Trail, which will allow anybody with a bike or on foot that's energetic to go anywhere essentially they want to go, because that trail goes on and on. So we've going into particulars now, I'll call this the rural map. You'll see that we put the hydro corridor on there. It's an orange, dotted orange line across, just intersects the railroad tracks. I don't know, everybody probably knows where it is, but there was a discussion that, is that corridor available for use as a walkway? And if around the table, we all thought it's a great idea, but it's also Hydro One, and how do you get Hydro One to agree to anything? So we put it on our wish list as something that would be desirable. I lived in Ottawa for a while, and they actually do use that trail across the south end of what used to be Nepean, and it's well used. And so I want to point out, Empty Road is in the northeast corner there. And what we call lot 32 concession 3 is a little red line, red or orange.
just south of Odessa, running straight south to Caton Road. And on Amherst Island, Marshall 40-foot is the orange line towards the east end of the island. And you'll also notice that the Stella 40-foot and third concession is also orange. So those are routes, the latter discussion, the orange lines are routes that came up when we talked with staff, and those are sort of recommended routes. When we talk with people involved with recreation and with the transportation folks, we said the possibility of taking people around on the island safely. And I'm talking, a family situation or something like that, as opposed to an experienced bike rider who's willing to withstand traffic and a little bit of gravel. That's not likely to happen for a long time. Let's try and come up with something that makes sense, both that we can facilitate and go after. And one of the things with Stella 40-foot is we now have the property to make a widening there or to make use of it. Third concession, we do not, but it's also a relatively low volume road. Empey Road is really only used by agricultural access, and similar as Marshall 40-foot. So going to the next slide, we shift to Amherst View. So I won't go through all the color coding, except on this one, the blue lines indicate what I call the community linkages, like areas that didn't have sidewalk. We're suggesting that would go in. And again, this is a long-term look. We're not saying all this has to go in today, tomorrow sort of thing, but it would be nice. Of note is that the collector roads, the Amherst Drive, the Kildares, the Spears, only are sidewalked on one side, single-sided for most of their lengths. And that's contrary to a lot of designs for higher volume collector roads. And we're recommending that get revisited and double up. In Amherst View, we're focusing on Amherst Drive as a potential route for a bike lane or a path or something like that. We started one on the west end. Ideally, that would get extended right through the whole community. We're kind of looking at that in sync with the traffic calming that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Another trail of note would be a north-south linkage along what I call the force main easement. It's not really an easement, it's a block of land that where if you were coming up from Briargate and went straight north and came out by the arena there, there's a land between the two subdivisions that carries the sewer force main to the sewage plant. And that land, everybody's used it informally as a walkway, but it could be improved. And it would provide good access to the park. And, if we do Amherst Drive, then there's good east-west. It shows a proposed linkage through Amherst View secondary plan on that map in the orange. And skipping to the next slide. This is community of Bath, obviously. Again, on Main Street, looking at linkage from east to west, improving that to a full, I'm going to call it a multi-use path. And again, whether it's a bike lane someday or whether it's a separated pedestrian path, that's to be decided in a detailed design process. Is this a good time to talk about? Yes, I think it is. Talking with folks across the aisle from us here, we're hearing that there's interest in a township-sponsored waterfront strategy, which would include looking at all the township's facilities and land along the waterfront and developing, I'm going to say a master plan, but a master plan approach of how that property will be utilized and accessed in the long term. And this has all happened in the last month or so that I've been made familiar with that. In the master plan, we were recommending that we would do a master plan of what I would call the lake on, or the waterfront trail across the township. That would be a study that would be undertaken. And what we're now proposing, after we hear about the waterfront strategy, that either those projects would be combined or run closely together so that they would mesh nicely at the end, sort of thing. So again, that allows our residents some great access to the water, promotes tourism, all those good things. I pointed a few of the projects in Bath that we're envisioning. The green lines are existing trails on this map. One of the safety things that we think is a high priority is replacing the paved shoulder that acts as a sidewalk from the school on Church Street north to Loyalist Boulevard. Replacing that paved shoulder with a new sidewalk that's on the west side. In the long-term plans, we see Windermere getting built out and coming back to that Loyalist Church Street or County Road 7 intersection. In approximately the location where it's shown, that route would have a trail along it, and it would attach to various existing trails on the eastern side of Bath. You'll see a few recommended sidewalks in some of the older communities. And next slide, please. This is Odessa. One of the problems with Odessa is many of the streets are 40-foot allowances that don't allow very much. We worked hard, I say we, Joe, who wasn't here, worked very hard trying to work that into the area just west of Bridge Street in the current project. And, you know, when we looked at cross sections and looked at traffic and all that stuff, it just wasn't working very well to put a separate sidewalk and try and maintain streets and drainage and all that stuff. So it is a bit of an animal, but that being said, there's been quite a bit of work done along Millhaven Creek to date, with the idea that that'll eventually be extended, you know, in the long term along that Millhaven Creek corridor. There's a proposal to try and enhance active transportation along Main Street. We see some infilling along William Street will require, and Shane Street is going to require some new sidewalks. Most of those are growth related, so there'll be, you know, that's the sort of thing where there'll be some cost sharing towards development charges. It shows the connection from there south to Caton Road and a proposal to use Old Wilton Road north to Maple Road as an initial step to get north eventually to Wilton. And again, that route needs to be finalized. Next slide, please. So we're now looking at remedial sidewalk screening, and again, a lot of this came up from complaints, and we had people go out and look at various locations, and we saw all sorts of things. Everything from places where sidewalks don't line up with intersections and stopping mid-block because that was the end of the phase of development, and for whatever reason, it was never picked up again. Poor sidewalk condition, undersize. And just on that note, when we look at the undersized sidewalks, these are typically 3-foot sidewalks. The standard's now 5 feet or 1.5 meters. The estimated cost to replace those substandard width sidewalks is $6 million, and that's not considering property. And knowing most of those locations, without property, you're not going to get a proper sidewalk in there. So it's not an easy issue to tackle. Okay, I don't think we need to spend too much time. This list is a list of sidewalks recommended to provide safe community linkages. And the prioritization of the streets on this list are when the road is rehabilitated. And I'm just going to go to the next slide here. This list is similar, but in this case, these are locations that probably would be standalone projects for various reasons. Either there's a bigger need for safety, or there's other problems that have been associated with it. I won't go into a lot of detail, but you can see where some of these areas are. A couple cases, there may be just things where the township doesn't have easement, where there's a major flow outlet, and it's advisable to get control of that so we can maintain it and clean it, inspect it, all that sort of thing. Moving on to the next slide, which is active transportation. How are we doing time-wise? Okay, I'm going to go a little faster. We mentioned before there was interest in more than sidewalks, use of paths. They seem to be very popular. They're popular anywhere they go in. I live in a community that has I'll call it a ring road path, and it's used. You wouldn't believe the number of people on it. We classify these a little bit for council to better understand why they're on the list. So we used easy to facilitate for the top three. Those roads are all roads that I would drive my personal car on, maybe not year round, but I've driven them all. I've ridden my bike on 2 of them. They're very accessible, so it's not a high cost to get them. And what they would provide is a nice walk through agricultural fields, or I'm going to call it re-emerging woodlands, that sort of thing that would be typical of Loyalist Township. Popular areas, self-explanatory, and community linkage sort of thing. So those are, trying to get things in place that get people out the doors, get some exercise. I mentioned long-term scenarios. The locations on this list are things to be chipping away at over the long term. And again, I didn't mention before, but by having the framework and everybody knowing where we're going, that means like when there's a severance or where there's a utility relocate, you can start lining up the pieces of the puzzle, getting the road widening in place, so that those projects are easily facilitated once the funding's available. If you wait till the last minute, say, geez, I'd like to go down Stella 40 foot, and you don't own any property, you're shit out of luck. As simple as that. It becomes a 5-year project and a lot of money. Okay, active transportation. Next, we are done that slide. Am I on the right slide? Sorry. Okay. So a few recommendations coming out of that is listed here. One is petitioning Lennox and Addington County to upgrade their standards and actually make bike lanes on busy roads. There'll need to be coordination with the township's official plan with the actual routes that are approved. I mentioned briefly before the waterfront strategy. So whatever waterfront pathways and stuff that evolve need to mesh with that and to work with our neighbors. Moving to traffic calming. So we were very fortunate on getting, I can't remember the number of years, but around 15 or 17 years of OPP accident data, which we were able to filter down to a road by road basis. And we took that data and we mapped it, and we got the data about the same time as the survey data came in from traffic calming. And we actually mapped, we didn't map it, but we made a table showing where all the complaints were from the survey. And it was unbelievable how close the complaints and the accident stuff showed up. It was night and day sort of thing. And out of that, we developed what I call the priority 1 list of maps of traffic calming concerns, which I'm going to flip the next slide and I'll just go quick on this. For Amherst, that priority 1 list looks like that map. And we also had priority two. And priority two roads were roads that we had lots of complaints, but the traffic data didn't support those complaints. So we thought, okay, we should look at those and see what's going on. So that work is underway, but it means getting traffic counts and meaningful traffic counts. And traffic counts during COVID don't count, simple as that. So we've got to kind of start from scratch on some of this stuff. But looking ahead, the sort of thing is, what do we do with this data? And one of the key things we did, I mentioned that we'd had high traffic counts, or we looked at the accident counts, and where those traffic accident counts were high, we called them priority one. We've had our consultant look at a few of those locations and convert those numbers into what she would term an accident rate. And she's come back and said our accident rate is actually quite reasonable for the volumes on those roads. So even though some of the people don't like the speed and that sort of thing, and I understand that, we're not way out of whack. And I'm saying that because we're as we look at the solutions are not cheap. And I just stress that. I've changed my tune. I think roads should be for people and not for cars, or at least local roads. And that's a position I didn't have not that long ago. But if that's the choice, it's going to be an expensive choice the council's going to have to make. So anyways, going back to where we're at, engineering staff and public works staff have sat around the table, met with our consultant, and it was decided that we would use Amherst Drive as a template. We chose Amherst Drive because from Spears to County Road 6, we're still in a position that we can finalize the design and implement it very shortly. And there's other areas of Amherst Drive that are coming up for reconstruction with some modifications and utility work and that sort of thing. So a good candidate where, a multi-phase project could happen. The review for just Amherst Drive with some suggestions was $20,000. So we have a good study. It's quite a reasonable and extensive study. But if we were to apply that across all the red roads that I'm going to show you, that in itself is probably 100,000, 150,000. And then I'm hearing that very simple little installations, like when you have 3 little flexible markers across the road, is about $1,000 an installation. So if you have them every 100 meters, then even a temporary setup like that is relatively expensive. Not mentioning the more extensive permanent installation. So moving to the next slide, I'm just going to show you quickly. The red is priority roads for traffic calming. And I would say Bath Main Street, with the volume of traffic and the pedestrian use, that is a definite priority. Next slide is Odessa. So no priority ones in Odessa. And on the island, we felt that the front road, Stella 40-foot intersection was an area of concern. And I'm not so sure if the accident history was there. It was more the comments and observations that staff had of that location and when the ferry comes in. So additional recommendations, update the traffic calming policy. So again, that was a policy that I was a co-writer of, and it was directed at roads for vehicles, not for people. So I'll leave that with you. Establish an ongoing traffic calming education program. I think there needs to be advertising out there for the trouble spots. Look at lower speed in residential streets. A lot of municipalities are going with setting lower speeds. The problem I see is if you don't have a physical way to make a driver drive slower, they're not going to drive slower. So just putting a sign up doesn't do it. That being said, maybe an expansion of the community safety zones with a police car there may be an option. Getting and maintaining good traffic data is important. And probably the most important of all is with new development guidelines that are under review, the municipality should really make sure that new residential development doesn't have long straight streets, because that only promotes quick, fast driving, and also minimizing access to higher volume urban collectors. So if I look at Kildare Avenue or that sort of thing, we're getting those complaints. Spears Boulevard, it's because there's a lot of driveways on a busy street and there's just not time to get out of there. Questions?
Council, any questions on the transportation? Councillor Budrick?
I have two through you, sir. One, could you possibly email us some of the ideas that you're looking at for traffic calming measures, just so we have a better understanding on different things you might try and implement? Obviously, there's some things in here, but some specific details. If you could do that, that would be great. And the other is
That's a definite.
okay, good. Because we're all going to have different thoughts and ideas, and I've seen something that works fantastic on Van Order Drive between Portsmouth and Norman Rogers. There are those permanent markers down the middle of the road that really narrows the perception of the width of the road, so people do reduce their speed. It's also a school zone, so that's why I know. But if you could ever check that out, that'd be great. But yeah, thank you.
Other questions regarding transportation? Councillor Willis.
Thank you through the chair. First of all, thank you for acknowledging that the end loading ferries and various other changes have changed traffic on Amherst Island. And I do agree very strongly that speed limits and stop signs and things like that need to be reviewed as soon as possible. If we go back to the map with the trails, if you could. Yeah. Yeah, on that one. So the black and white dots, are you saying those would be newly established trails because they're going through private property?
Well, those. Sorry, through the chair, the black dots on that map, with the exception of up in the northeast corner, are all representation of mapping that's found in our official plan. So those were conceptual mapping of where, in the long term, trails would like to be developed. So yes, we recognize that a lot of that is on private property, and hence sort of the refocus of this study is, looking at primarily at even using the shore roads, in my opinion, isn't all that great. And again, there's certain times when I wouldn't be bothered by walking, but I wouldn't be comfortable with a young family out there saying, that's a good place to go.
So why wouldn't you use the Emerald 40-foot as part of a proposed trail system?
It could be. We didn't propose to change the official plan. That wasn't our objective. We were just looking at, I guess, more at what could we facilitate in the short term. And that's where Marshall 40-foot came up. We also looked at the concession between north and south concession. I think that's the right name, if I get it right, from the cemetery going east. And it kind of met all our check marks in terms of, a bit of a natural environment away from the traffic, but the amount of wetland in there made it fairly cost prohibitive to go in there. We didn't bother with the ecology study there, but as soon as you start getting into permanent water or near permanent, you're into areas that the environmental constraints get high.
Right.
So if I could also add, I know it's problematic. We get a lot of questions about that because of the conceptual trail. But now that we have a more defined, we've looked at active transportation, we have a little bit of a better idea of what we want to do with trails. Our planning friends are also involved in this IMP project. It is something that we may try to align next time we do an OP review. If we have a better idea of what where the trail should be, there could be a possibility to adjust that map to stop kind of those questions like, you're going through private property, the trail there doesn't make sense. And like Dave said, it's a concept at this point, but as we defined our active transportation proposals, there's going to be an opportunity to maybe realign those maps on the official plan.
Maybe I'll just add that the mapping that's there is, we've looked at all those routes and think that they're workable. Some have more constraints than others, but that was we took a fair amount of time on that.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Sorry, so you're saying that crossing what is existing private property is a workable plan?
No, what we're saying is the roads that we're showing in the IMP, which are not the black and white dotted,
Okay.
are ones that we think have a good chance of success over the 25-year time frame.
Yes. I'll just summarize that because without a mic, it won't be heard on the on YouTube. So the black and white line around Amherst Island that rings the island is pre-amalgamation that was brought forward from the Amherst Island official plan, and it's been maintained in all the official plans since then. So it's a concept, but it's still shown here in the IMP. Thank you for sharing that. Councillor Ennis.
Thank you, and through the chair. I'm just wondering about the active transportation multi-use pathway and a connection between Odessa and Amherstview. So it looks like showing the one leg, at least between Timmerman and Caton. It's hard to tell. And I remember when the survey went out, there was also along Coronation and perhaps the extension of the right-of-way. Or, is there a way on this map to, in some fairly direct manner, on a potential multi-use pathway, get between Odessa and Amherstview?
That's a good question and one we couldn't answer at the moment. The shortest route looks like County Road 6. And with the railroad tracks and stuff there, that's messy, but that's about the only option. I don't see us doing a pedestrian crossing over the railroad tracks. That might be an option and negotiating some sort of access along private property. But realistically, I think that's working with the county and coming up with some sort of corridor, similarly with possibly from the Wilton area coming down County Road 6 too. You did mention along the eastern boundary, that road allowance does exist, and it's what I'll call an open unmaintained allowance. So similar to Caton Road, similar to Marshall 40, but pardon me. And you could make a connection, say, to Caton Road. That's an option. We did look at that. We just felt that I'll call it the interest might be more along County Road 6, just because the kids going to school and familiar. And just joining our communities. Now, mind you would have a good access to the city of Kingston if they did something, into the West End there, sort of thing, Westbrook area.
And Councillor Parks, I'll work my way down. You'll be next.
Thank you. Just a couple of quick statements. I just want to acknowledge the fact that there's been some consideration for sidewalks in some of the older communities of the Village Bath, Houghton Park and Village Meadows. That's great because there's a lot of families that live in those areas and walk their children to school. So I do hear that quite a bit. Also wanted to acknowledge that there's a consideration for the Main Street crossing on the south side of the highway. If you're on the east end of the village, you pretty much need to come down to the stoplights or try to cross, and it's dangerous. So that's great to hear. The other thing I just wanted to mention in regards to calming measures, if it's something that could be considered, County Road number 7 heading north, when people come around the corner off of Main Street and go up the hill, it's an interesting event to sit there and watch the traffic go out there. So that might be something to consider too.
Through the mayor, those will be duly noted. County road. Sorry. County Road 7 is a county jurisdiction, so we'll have to pass that on to the county and shake them a bit.
Thank you.
Councillor Broderick.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you. Could I ask you to go back to the, or forward, I guess it is, to the Amherstview map? That one's good right there. So, Mr. Thompson, you're probably in my age cohort and might appreciate a little refresher. So Amherstview started in the late 50s. Riverwood Homes built the first maybe 100 homes. And at the time, it was obviously built as a suburban satellite to Kingston. You could drive from Portsmouth to basically Coronation and not see a heck of a lot there. And obviously over the years, it's turned into, I would say, more than a satellite, but I can appreciate that you sort of maybe come to a fruition to realize now, as much as it was a car-driven thing, we need to sort of turn the tables and go to more of a maybe a pedestrian community, et cetera, et cetera. So the problem with that has been that, I remember the days when Amherstview ended at Havergale going north, and when Amherst Drive ended at the fire hall, and when Upper Park wasn't there, and everything pretty well west of Spears was where we used to drive our bikes and our motorbikes and whatever. So as times progressed, all these streets, Amherst Drive, Kildare, Manitou, have become basically highways. People go from A to B, there's no connection. And, even Kidd Drive, where the city buses go through, our Route 10, that's a freeway too. And I think I'm not going to get myself in trouble here, but the city buses are one of the worst offenders in terms of speed and so on. So I just that's just sort of a preamble to my ambling on here. I got a few questions or maybe statements just in sort of looking at sidewalks and look at traffic calming. Are sidewalks part of a traffic calming plan, or are they more of an aside to more of the pedestrian? Because sidewalks aren't going to slow down traffic, I don't think.
Through the chair, I would say generally they're treated as separate things, but I think it goes hand in hand. Why do you want traffic calming? So that people can get out and enjoy themselves. The only exception that's coming to mind, that's one of the examples that we're seeing is something like a raised crosswalk or something like that. That's or either physically raised or painted to look like it's raised, or it's just painted. But that sort of combination of thing may alert a driver. Now, I don't know if they do it 1,000 times, they may forget it, but the intent of the design is that sort of feature would slow it down. So, with signage and that sort of thing.
Okay,
I don't have experience in the results of it, but
Yeah.
that's certainly one of the recommendations.
No, fair enough. So just some general, and if anybody here has the answer, we don't want to put Mr. Thompson on the spot in his semi-retirement days, but what's the standard shoulder width for a bike lane? I hear that conversation a lot. I'm thinking more of the county, the request towards the county to look at that.
Yeah, sorry, through you, Mr. Mayor. I don't have the number, but I guess when you're talking about the county right now, they have a paved shoulder program. And so when you're looking at it's called the Ontario Traffic Manuals, which outlines all the standard widths and everything. They're recommending having physical separation, especially for higher speed highways. So right now, if the paved shoulder is, say, 1 meter in the county, you would want to be adding on, an additional meter, meter and a half for a buffer, something along those lines. But I don't have the exact number. It would all come based on the Ontario Traffic Manual guidelines, as well as the specific speed criteria and, anticipated pedestrians or bicycle counts. Dave, if you have the number offhand, then.
I don't have the number offhand, but I have the design chart. So MJ is going to make a note to send that out. And basically it's a function of speed and volume on the road. Gets you to different plateaus. The more cars, the more speed, the more separation.
Okay. And again, continuing through the chair, you have an idea, anybody have an idea the percentage of roads that in Amherstview or Ward 3 that aren't sidewalk? Like, is it 25%? Like, even just a general ballpark, how much sidewalk space or potential sidewalks there are, I guess. I'm a numbers guy sometimes.
I don't have numbers, but I probably had a similar question myself when this map was prepared. And I said, in my 28 years, how many sidewalks did I put in that older area? And I kind of eyeballed it and said, that looks about the same as what we're proposing in this 25 years. That's
Okay.
about as close as I can do it. That number is available though.
Fair enough. And just inside, like, we lived on Rothwell for probably 20 plus years. No sidewalks, no stop signs. I'm guilty of that going through, and this isn't maybe a conversation for you, but I just think of the township liability of not having a stop sign where, somebody bangs into it. Okay. Just give me a second here. I'm all over the place. I can appreciate, and I would strongly support any opportunity, and I'm talking long-term, long beyond my days, just connecting the Parrots Bay, and you mentioned Lost Lake. That's sort of a hidden gem in our township, and I doubt there's many people in this room that have been there. I've been there, and it's, I'm probably trespassing at the time, but I know that that's just like 1978. Come on. So I know there's the Queens owns a tract there, and I know the township owns some property along there, but I would encourage something like that. Again, just the Coronation sidewalk scenario, that being a county road shared with the city of Kingston, is that something beyond our control, or is that a sort of a county, we'd really like you to do this and we'll help you out? Because I see people every day and I wonder how somebody has been killed on that road, walking their dog or whatever.
Yeah, through the chair. Basically, I think the county will go out of their way to facilitate that sort of setup at our expense, at the township expense. And, the first thing that comes up when a remedial sidewalk installation is like that is, well, what do you do with the drainage? Because there's a ditch there and that's a major storm ditch.
Yeah.
That has to be accommodated somehow. So if that ends up being a pipe underground, that can be an expensive solution. I'm not saying it would, that's the outcome, but I do agree, that's a situation where, over time, traffic has grown from the suburban little hamlet that it was to what it is today. And, it's been an oversight that has probably left as long as it has.
Okay, just a couple other things. So I went along in front of Mount Carmel School today at about 2:40. And the cars parked along there was absolutely unbelievable. And as Councillor Buderick had mentioned, I believe before, about school safety zones, the city of Cornwall now has, I think they're called bollards in front of every school. And it does significantly slow down traffic. And I know you mentioned $1,000 a piece or whatever, but I also go back to, especially in front of a school, given what happened last year, I guess now it's 2 years ago in Kingston, that's a price that's worth paying. Again, that's my high horse, but I think that's something we need to consider. And we are only looking at maybe, 4 or 5 schools in our area in general. And again, I would also support, and you mentioned, Mr. Thompson, the hydro in Ottawa. Cornwall, the same thing. The bike path cuts right through the hydro it may not happen tomorrow, but it's something definitely worth, if we're looking at a 25-year plan. You know, I just don't know how snowmobilers aren't going through there on their own without even worrying about who owns the property and stuff like that. And just to finish, I'm no traffic expert, but the plan here where the high density areas is, you could ask almost anybody in Amherst and they would have drawn the same map. And I guess my concern is, I think Amherst West, and again, you had mentioned sort of the straight line traffic. I'm hoping in that design, we're going to get it right. And I'm not blaming anybody. That's just the way Amherst developed over 50s to the, as we are now, that somehow we can come up with a way to slow down the traffic on Amherst, Kildare, Manitou, and maybe, you know, it's making a total change in the speed limit. But then again, that's dependent on enforcement, which we don't really have a thing on. But as we move forward on this, I would just encourage any kind of traffic calming. That's what I heard more than anything else last October. And you had mentioned that Amherst Drive, the study, there's going to be a framework. So in the sense of being a framework, what does that mean to like Kildare? Is there going to be like a data-driven framework where if you get to this level, or is it just more of a, here are the different options?
Sorry, through the chair again. There's definitely going to be options, and I'm sure council will be seeing those shortly. The one concern that we're having, and this happens all the time, if let's just say Amherst, whatever happens on Amherst Drive is successful, the results of that might shift that traffic somewhere else, and the likely candidate is Kildare. So to move forward with Amherst Drive exclusively is probably, you know, all the way is probably not a good idea. So we're suggesting some sort of steps, and I don't know what those steps are, but that'll be coming forward. That's what's being worked on right now, fine tuned.
Fair enough. And, you know, thank you for your work on this. And like I said, my little history lesson there, that's what happens over time. It just shifts to somewhere else. And, you know, until we're all driving bikes and rickshaws, it's not going to really have a major effect. But thank you. Thank you all for your work.
Councillor Ennis.
Thank you, and through the chair. And just a comment on traffic calming in the Odessa area, and noting that currently in this plan, there's no areas of priority. I hear a lot of concerns from residents for the Odessa Public School Zone, following up on Councillor Broderick's comments about the school zone in Mount Carmel. Same idea. And as well, a lot of concerns from residents on Potter and Creighton. And as I just, you know, make the comment that as that subdivision is built out and there's more traffic in that area and there's more kids going to school in that area, where the numbers, you know, may not be there now, they may be there shortly. So just highlighting those as perhaps, you know, areas to keep in mind.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Would you like to respond to that?
Just a very quick response is, and maybe I glossed over a little bit, but with the county project going through, we're sitting at the table, or, you know, our staff are, and, you know, that's been front and foremost. You will see those crossings in, I think, as early as next year, and sidewalks on the balance of Potter and Creighton, and possibly on South Street. I'm not sure either, short little lake there. I'm not sure on the South Street detail, but definitely Potter and Creighton are being looked at, and West Street and Durham. So it's the county project, but we're at the table on it.
Just to follow up on that, at the county level, the deputy and I sit at, that's the reports that are coming back to us. While they're finalizing the designs and everything of Main Street of Odessa and starting at the west end, working easterly, those intersections that you talked about and the traffic, foot traffic in that area is one of the things that they are trying to address. There's a few options, but we do have staff at the table, and they're helping work with the county staff to make sure we try to address everything the first time we go through. So I just have a few myself before I turn it back to you. The one thing that came up was it referred to the TAC requirements for bicycle lanes. And I'm looking at our public works. Would the deputy mayor and I be able to receive a copy of those requirements at some point in the future? And simply, the more information we have when we're sitting at the county council table is always beneficial to us. And I know I've looked at them before, but I'm just, that would save me trying to find them again and forgetting to do it. Yes.
Just for clarification, you're talking about the county TAC requirements or the national TAC requirements?
Well, the national would be, is the national what we would be building out to or desiring to build out to, or is it the county?
We're desired would be the national level.
Okay, that's, if
Okay.
whichever's desired,
Yeah,
that's,
we have those and we can get those out.
okay, thank you. Community safety zones has been mentioned a few times, just so happens that AMO, I ran into a local public works director, I believe he is now, from the area here. And we had a really good discussion about the community safety zones and how they've been working through getting them implemented to the stage of being implemented in their area. And I found it very helpful and educational. And that's one of the things that I've been looking at as well is a time for us to start looking at doing that so that we can try to do some, at least in front of areas such as the school zones and things like that. And then look at the greater community after that. So that was just a note. We've been talking about, it's been referred to as bike paths and walkways and stuff on other road authorities. And I just wanted to draw attention. A lot of the times they refer to it as a partially paved or a paved shoulder. Higher road authorities typically hesitate using the term bike path or walk path along a highway because it goes back to the old adage that roads are for cars. So they put shoulders. If they're used for bicycles or for foot traffic, then it's an option, but they're designed typically as a paved or a partially paved shoulder, and right or wrong. And one of it is, one is getting the separation between the traffic and the pedestrians or the riders. The other is maintenance, and especially winter maintenance. As soon as you put a barrier up, winter maintenance is a huge obstacle. And so there's always the design discussion of how do we bring both together without making one or the other side of it more difficult and somewhat impossible to do. And that's always the elephant in the room is you want one thing, but how do we make it work in the long run? So I was just bringing that up, that if you're talking to other road authorities, you'll hear them say partially paved and paved shoulders. That's the widened asphalt along the roadway. And that's what most people do use as a bicycle path. I had one other, but I'm going to leave it. That's good. So if there's no other comments or questions from council. Yep, I was just going to turn it back. There was a designated break, but I don't remember where it is. Is this a good time for it?
Absolutely, Your Worship. So I was going to suggest a quick 5-minute break before we dive into water and sewage for the last part of our presentation, and then we can come back.
Okay, very good. We'll plan on being back roughly 8:20. Thank you. Okay, we'll reassume the meeting. And I did have a question during the break, so I just wanted to clarify what my last statement was. Other road authorities pave the roads, pave the shoulders, typically a meter or a meter and a half wide. They're shoulders, they're not bike paths, they're not designated bike paths or walk paths. So I just wanted to clarify that didn't confuse anyone calling them a bike path. They are a paved shoulder, they're for vehicular traffic, but people do use them as a bike path or a walking path, and that is their option to do so. So with that, I will turn it back over for the next section.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. So for those following along in the report, we're on page 17. And so we are diving now into the water section of the IMP. Next slide. Perfect. So when we're talking about water, again, we're looking at those overarching themes of growth, remedial, regulatory, technological, and climate change driving these projects, and particular focus on our Fairfield and Bath water treatment plants, as well as the general distribution system and storage system. Next slide. So when we are looking at our water demand, we're considering how growth will impact the water treatment. And these are primarily driven through residential, institutional, industrial, commercial. You'll hear me refer to that as ICI flows frequently. And then we're also considering the committed but unbuilt residential units. So Councillor Broderick, when you were asking that question earlier about that line on the graph, those are those committed units that are already planned through the development process and have approvals in place. So we know those units are coming online. It's just a question of when. And the last note there is just, we use the revised high growth scenarios to calculate residential and ICI demands. And when we were doing that, we assumed that the ICI growth would match that same residential growth in terms of the revised high growth scenario. Next slide. So Fairfield Water Treatment Plant. So when we're looking at the projections for the plant, we have prepared the chart on the right that looks at a number of things. So to start with, you'll see the scale on the chart on the left represents the total plant capacity, which is rated at 8,000 meters cubed. So when we talk about rated capacity, that's what we have MECP approval for in terms of the ability of the plant to treat the water to then serve the distribution system. We'll note the red line across is 80% of capacity. And this is an important milestone as the MECP requires that you start a planning process once you have committed 80% of the units. And then we also recommend that once the actual flows reach 80%, that you start the physical expansion process. So that typically takes approximately 3 to 5 years once you go through design and construction. So you'll note that we are currently committed above 80%. And so the IMP satisfies that requirement in terms of planning for that future expansion. And then once the actual flows, which are projected to reach 80% in around 2033, it would then start that 3 to 5 year process. So that way you'll never actually reach 100% of your plant flows, giving you an appropriate safety factor. One of the things that I'll also note is that we can adjust that committed capacity by reducing water loss through the system. So right now, all those projections are based on what is called an equivalent residential unit, which is the approximate value that one household of water uses. If we're able to reduce that amount of an ERU equivalent residential unit, it will delay need for the costly expansions that are associated with that. And that's done through water loss. So I know we've talked frequently about water meter replacement programs, as well as keeping up with capital repairs to prevent breaks from occurring. as well as just general leaks that are occurring and not necessarily able to be monitored within the system. And then there's a number of other initiatives that we can look at doing, such as zone metering to try and track where within the system those losses are occurring. And then the last bullet point there is we still need to account for the available capacity when allocating new capacity. So next slide. So this slide demonstrates on the right is a graphic of the process flow diagram for the Fairfield water treatment plant. And so when we were assessing the capacity for the plant, what we did was we retained a consultant, JL Richards, to complete a desktop exercise, which was looking at each of the individual components within the system. I won't go through everything on there, but the one point to highlight is the primary treatment system within the Fairfield plant is an ultrafiltration membrane system. And that was sized from the original construction for easy expansion. And those easy expansions were to the two numbers noted there on the screen. So 10,750 meters cubed a day and 15,000 meters cubed a day. And so when we retained the consultant to look at the expansion, we identified those two scenarios as we understand what's possible for the membranes. Now we need to understand what's required for the granular activated carbon or the pumps or the various components within the plant to identify any other bottlenecks that would need to be graded at the same time. Next slide. So this chart represents that sort of bottleneck analysis under the two different scenarios. And you can see the highlighted elements identifying where the bottlenecks within the plant are occurring. And it helps us to understand what will be needed for that future expansion. So again, I won't go through all the individual components. It's important just to understand what's going to be required for that future expansion. Yep, thank you. The priority projects. So aside from the expansions that are required, we're also identifying the following priority projects, which are, as David pointed out earlier, you'll see in the top right, it's identified as new projects. So these are new initiatives. And the first one there is to upgrade pumps with more efficient options that meet the capacity needs and install VFDs, being variable frequency drives. What VFDs do is it allows us to modulate a pump and reduce our overall energy consumption. So that's important when we're looking at that theme of climate change, is reducing our energy consumption can help us meet the targets through the climate action plan. The second bullet there is conduct a raw water intake structure assessment to help us assess the current condition. I believe if we go back a slide, we see there that the raw water intake is required for improving the process. So getting an understanding of where we're at in that overall structure is important for the future plans. And then the last bullet there is conducting a chlorine contact time and clear well assessment. And this will help us determine if operational changes can help delay the need for upgrades on those components. Next slide. So Bath water treatment plant. So when we're looking at the projections for Bath, it's noted that we're not projecting to exceed the plant's rated capacity by 2046 within the study period. A couple points that I'll note on this chart is the total plant capacity is the left-hand side of the graph, which is 6,000 meters cubed a day. The green line across represents 80% of the plant capacity. And I'll note that we have committed more than 80% of the plant's capacity at this time. One distinction that this graph has that's a little different from the Fairfield system is the large gray commitment within the overall chart there. And that gray commitment represents signed agreements with CSC that we need to provide them with a certain amount of water flow regardless of their actual usage. We have to reserve that capacity within the system no matter what. And then Again, I'll highlight that we can always help to delay future expansions by reducing water losses throughout the system. And the last note there is that no further infill capacity is anticipated to be available after 2034. Next slide. So once again, for Bath, we undertook the same assessment that we did for Fairfield with our consultant, JLR. And again, it was following a similar thought process where we know that we have gravity membrane filters there that can be easily expanded to 7,200 meters cubed per day. And so each step of the treatment process was evaluated against that expansion to see then where those potential bottlenecks are. Next slide. And so in this scenario, we've highlighted where those bottlenecks are within the system, and these will form projects for a future expansion if that is necessary. And then for Bath, the new projects that are identified, again, follow a similar vein to the Fairfield system. So installing VFDs to help with our climate action goals, conducting a raw water intake structure assessment, and then optimize operations by increasing the minimum water level and free chlorine residual maintained in the clear well to meet CT as contact time requirements. Our consultant also flagged a couple other new projects with the Bath system specifically. So these follow two themes, which are disinfection and taste and odor. So for disinfection, currently the contact time for disinfection is below the rated capacity of the plant. So this does not mean that we have an issue meeting our current demands on the system, as the rated capacity represents what the MEC has approved us for, but it does mean that before we reach that flow, we will need to address disinfection in the plant as a project. We've also flagged taste and odor concerns. So there's been seasonal taste and odor events in the raw and treated water at the Bath water treatment plant. And so these two problems are linked when you're looking at potential solutions. So that's why they're treated together. And so the recommended strategy coming from the INV is a UV disinfection system to provide primary disinfection needs, as well as pressurized granular activated carbon filters, which have been successfully used at this plant in the past. And the combination of these two technologies will help us meet those needs for the plant. Water distribution, storage. So when we're looking at the water distribution system, there's a number of remedial projects that have been flagged. And so again, just as a reminder, using Dave's definition for remedial, it is not a like-for-like water main replacement. If it's a 10-inch water main and it needs to be a 10-inch water main and we're just replacing it because it's end of life, that's not included in this analysis. Remedial is still along the lines of new, bigger, or better. So the following projects are being recommended. The reduction of system water loss, which I've spoken to already, and this can be done through smart meters, meter replacements, and keeping up with capital projects and things of that nature. And then the disinfection process byproducts and taste and odor concerns. And so one of the benefits of that dual approach to the disinfection and taste and odor is it helps reduce the amount of byproducts within the system, which can ultimately reduce flushing needs and operational constraints on the bath system. The following reconstructions are being recommended. So Mott Street, there's a pressure reducing valve, which has a number of operational constraints. And so that's being recommended to be upgraded. The County Road 6, Main Street, Odessa to Millhaven Road, we're recommending service and valve upgrades. So there's a number of pipes in that intersection and heading south from Main Street, Odessa. And so we're just flagging that when a capital project is occurring in that area, that the valving be optimized as well as along with the main replacements. And then Church Street, so a water line update is just providing an upsized sewer for Church Street. Next slide. So water distribution for growth, the following projects are being recommended. So Lakeside Ponds, the new development in Amherstview, water main oversizing to allow for future development to occur within the Amherstview system. Taylor Kidd extension of the water main. Windermere Boulevard corridor. So in Bath, the future extension of the Windermere collector provides an important hydraulic link within the community that would eventually connect hydraulically from Main Street, Bath, linking up Windermere over to County Road 7. And that'll help improve fire flows within the community. And then the following reconstruction projects are being recommended. So Main Street, Bath, there's water main upsizing, and then as well as some miscellaneous trunk water connections throughout the system. Water storage. So we have completed an assessment of the water storage available within the two systems. So in Bath, the system storage is currently below the required capacity, and options are being evaluated to determine the best solution forward. One thing that I will note is that the required capacity in Bath, we have a reserve set aside for CSC that is over and above of the requirements that the MECP has. And the MECP, when they're calculating it, it is based on flows in terms of, say, residential flows as well as fire flows in the system and a buffer capacity. And so one way that we can delay potential expansions would be to get, again, water losses reduced within the system, is that then affects those calculations and can give us additional time before future expansion is required. And then in the Fairfield distribution system, the system storage will be near capacity in 2026. However, recently in the Fairfield system, we have seen some significant water reductions related to repairs on water main breaks. And that is, again, hopefully helping us extend out that need to expand the need for water storage based on what I mentioned previously. So that's it. So questions on the water section?
Thank you. Council, any questions or comments? Councillor Broderick.
Through your worship, just a couple of general questions, Luke. Can you just, if you can go back to that last slide just for a sec. Just in layman's terms, when I see system water storage, what is that? Is that the water that's in a tower, or do you have it hidden away somewhere in a little locker or something? You know, like, what does that mean?
It's a mix of both. So the primary water storage that is provided is within the towers. That's where the bulk of the volume is. We also have some clear wells within the plants that are potentially available for water storage as well. And then not necessarily a tower, but obviously at County Road 6 and Taylor Kidd, there's the big blue tank, which is a different system, but ultimately provides water storage as well.
Okay, and if I could just continue for 1 minute here. I did a tour of the Fairfield plant way back, and I was impressed with the facility. So when you mention expansion, are you talking a new build, a building, or is it just expanding within what is in that, I guess, let me see, just the shell of the building? You're not talking adding buildings, you're more adding filters within the infrastructure that's there?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, that's correct. The expansion of the facility would be primarily focused on the expansion of the membranes, as that's where the majority of the treatment capacity is. But there may be a need to expand the footprint slightly to accommodate future tanks and things like that. Items like that would primarily be determined through detailed design once you get into things like piping layout and pumping layout within the plant and, you know, exact tank volumes. Our consultant has recommended some conceptual designs for each plant, but both of those would need to be validated for future designs.
And in that future design, is it one of those things where you could do need the filtration and then down the road do the other additional capacity like tanks or whatever, or is it all one project in a sense? I know I'm putting the cart before the horse here, but
Yeah, so flipping back to the table that identified the bottlenecks within the system, what that's identifying is if we want to expand the bath plant to that, I think it was 7,500 or sorry, 7,200 number, we would have to do each of those items labeled as a yes. So there's the other components that are saying we have adequate capacity within, say, the raw water conveyance or the membrane permeate conveyance, but the raw water pumping would need to be upsized to accommodate that also with the membrane expansion.
okay. In the report around page 25, you probably have this right off the top of your head, so you don't have to look. Lakeside Ponds talked about water main oversizing. So is that something that the township is asking the builder to do, or is that something the township is doing? Because my understanding is Lakeside Ponds is sort of still under construction, so. Are you, again, just to add one little thing to it, are you asking them to go from 10 inches to 12 inches type thing, or, what's the standard there, I guess?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. So when we talk about water main oversizings within new developments, that's an item that's typically paid for through impost fees. And what we're talking about would be going from a 300 a 12 inch to a 400 a 16 inch. And so that increase in size allows us to plan for future fire flows, primarily in other developments. And so it's not a direct developer responsibility, which is why, as it's planning for future growth, we use it through the impost fees.
Okay, and just a comment more than a question. I know we put aside the capacity for future use. In terms of builder capacity, does that ever run out? Like, does a builder have a certain timeline to meet to protect their capacity, I guess I would say?
Yes and no. So right now, capacity is allocated through draft plan approvals. And so a draft plan could potentially be revoked. And if the draft plan was revoked, that capacity would be revoked as well. One of the things that we'll be recommending and is mentioned in a future slide is a capacity allocation policy. And that's something that we can do to help clarify what that process would be in terms of revoking and reallocating capacity.
Councillor Willis.
The chair. The CSC agreement, is that an evergreen agreement or does it have an end date on it?
Yeah, the answer is yes and no.
Okay.
When the plant was expanded on both water and sewer, CSC paid for a portion of that. So in essence, those agreements don't really expire because they purchased a certain volume. But there are some, there's an expiry. There's a term of those agreements that we review. I think they're 10 or 15 years, probably, if you look into it, but it's like 10 and 15 years that you can look back at, review the agreements. But in essence, they did purchase a certain volume, and unless it's a mutual agreement that, we could make some trades, unless we can make those trades, then basically that's their volume and we need to carry that.
Do they use their full allocation or is there room to negotiate a reduction in their allocation if we need more for future development?
No, that's a great question. On the waters, they don't on, well, actually, I say it's some time of the year, there's sewer allocation. They do pay an excess fee. And it's essentially because they have quite a few leaks in their sewage system. So there's a lot of infiltration. And so in certain times of the year, they do go over their volume, but they in the agreement, it was negotiated that they would pay in excess. On the water side, they are not using their entire capacity. But again, on the water side, you also have to think about fire flows. So you don't want to be using 100% of your capacity on a normal day because you're going to have some fluctuation in there. Yeah. So the water, so they found that the agreement with CSC for the water side ends in 2030. And the sewage, you said 2030? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Councillor Parks.
Through you, Your Worship. Just to follow up on Councillor Willis's questions, I'm back to the CSC agreement too. So just so I understand this, they originally paid to basically maintain a flow or a volume, sorry, a volume. And that volume sits in the tanks. And they only pay for like a monthly service like we do as residential payers. So they only pay based on what they receive, not on the volume. Does that make sense? Because we're sitting with treated water in the tank and it's sitting as volume and it's not technically being used. That's my question.
So that's a good question. So that agreement actually has different parts. So when the plant was first expanded, that was, it's going to cost this much money for you to have, let's say 300 cubic meters. You're paying for that. That's done now. They paid for it. On an ongoing basis, as you said, they pay for the amount of water that they use. They also pay the same proportion. So for example, if they use 50% of the water that is produced by the treatment plant, they pay 50% of the operations costs. They pay 50% of the ongoing maintenance of the equipment as well. It is similarly on the sewage side. It's similar agreements.
So it's not just based on consumption, it's also based on some of the other factors in the contract that
Yes.
they cover some of the maintenance costs. Okay, that makes more sense. If I can follow up with a couple of questions for Mr. McDonald. When you talk about the ICI assessed growth or assumed growth, I guess it was, moving forward, when we talk about the challenges that this municipality has to attract industrial, commercial, and institutional sources for that, would that be historically correct? Would that match what the residential growth has been in the past?
I might start this one and then ask Dave to sort of add it onto it as he's got a lot of historical knowledge. My understanding is that typically with ICI, you see large spikes. So residential growth, you might see consistent, new subdivision after new subdivision built, whereas ICI, there might not be anything for 5 years, and then a large development comes in, and then, you might get a couple small commercial plazas and then nothing, and then sort of a spike later on too. Dave, I don't know if you want to add any more context to that.
I would say that if you excluded anything that happened in the Taylor Kidd Industrial Park, that assumption that ICI growth matches residential would be reasonably close. And I'm talking about the restaurants or the schools or the nursing homes or barbershop or whatever. When you start talking about the needs of corporations in the industrial park, you essentially have a full spectrum that could be anything. I've seen people wanting 8,000 meters a day. Umicore, I believe, is in the range of 200 meters a day. Celanese was in the range of 200 meters a day. What was Bombardier? I can't remember the name of it now, but Alstom, whatever. They're in the range of 14 meters a day. So, the full spectrum is there. So it's really hit and miss in that, but it's a topic we're going to revisit here shortly.
Thank you. So you actually led into my question about Umicore. So they're going to connect into the water and sanitary services with.
Can we hit that in a few moments?
Is that okay? It's going to come up.
You're good then. Any other questions or comments from council? I'll follow up with just a few of my own then. I just wanted to clarify that you mentioned MECP, and I'm not sure if you said does or does not include the CSC usage in our committed. So what the institutions are using or is committed to them, is that, I'm assuming that is in the MECP.
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Mayor, the MECP guideline outlines a process to calculate required fire flow and storage needs in terms of residential and ICI. The CSC agreement is in addition to those numbers. So the CSC agreement outlines a very specific volume. I don't have the number offhand. And then we add that on top of the MECP guidelines for calculating our storage needs.
So it's calculated in, it's not a requirement of MECP because it was basically already bought when they built it. Okay, it threw me off because I thought if it's not included. And I guess the I&I and the capital investments we've proven is key for identifying any leaks or infiltration. And we have done a fair bit of work over the years on that. In the institutional CSC property, the leaks in there, is there anything we can do about that? Because I'm assuming that once it crosses a property line, it's their pipes, they're responsible for it, but it impacts us in our sewage treatment plant and our water filtration. Is there any way we can try to encourage them if in fact they are in control of them and we can't do anything? Is there anything we can do to try and encourage them to work with us on it?
Absolutely, through the rates. So, sorry, because the meter is installed at their property line, if they have major leaks, they're paying for that. Similarly, on the sewage side, but that's a double-edged sword. So we do get the revenue, but it also impacts our capacity at the plant. So there's going to be a balance there somewhere. Now we do have a very close relationship with them. It's real-time monitoring of water flows. And we do know, because we do have a water meter on their line, we do know when their flow rates are starting to spike. And it's a phone call and say, okay, what's happening? Do you guys have a fire? Is there a water main break somewhere? Similarly on the sewage side as well.
Okay, thank you. The meter at the fence?
That's key.
Makes a big difference. Okay, that wraps mine up. So is there anything further? Seeing none, we will turn it back.
All right, thank you. So moving into the sanitary section of our presentation. So when we're looking at the sanitary scope, again, I'll emphasize that we're looking at growth, remedial, regulatory, technological, and climate change as our themes that are guiding this assessment. And then when we're talking about the sanitary scope, the focus is once again on the two plants. So the Amherstview Water Pollution Control Plant and the Bath Sewage Treatment Plant, as well as our sewage pumping stations. So when we're looking at wastewater demand, so it's primarily focused on how will growth impact wastewater treatment demand. And again, it's a very similar analysis to the water where we're considering the residential demand, the ICI demand, as well as our committed but unbuilt residential units. And so again, we're looking at the high growth scenario to calculate residential and ICI demand, assuming the ICI growth is the same as residential growth. Moving into the Amherstview Water Pollution Control Plant. So once again, we started with our projections. So when we're looking at the chart on the right, I'll note that the total plant capacity on the left-hand side of the graph is 6,400 meters cubed. The green line across represents the 80% capacity. And I'll note that we have committed just under 80% of the capacity currently. But if you see the flows below, you'll see significant variations from year to year that represent around 55% in low years to 70% of actual flows of the rated capacity in high years. And similar process to the water. Once the actual flows reach the 80%, which is projected to happen around 2032, we would start that process to expand the plant. And so again, that's a 3 to 5 year process where we're going through detailed design and construction of the expansion. And then next slide. So for wastewater, we retain a consultant, RV Anderson, to complete a similar bottleneck analysis that we did on the water side, to check how the plant compares the available capacity to the future required capacity at the plant. One item we'll highlight on this chart is that right now the headworks of the facility is identified as not meeting the rated capacity of the plant. So even though we meet the flow requirements that we have today, it will need to expand prior to an expansion of the rated capacity of the plant. When we are looking at headworks, though, we do have some operational flexibility available to us in terms of an overflow lagoon that would be able to be used to prevent any spills prior to treatment. So if we go to the next slide, I think I get into the headworks strategy a bit more in detail. And so when we're looking at the headworks is the where the influent comes in from all the various pumping stations at the very start, the head of the plant. And so when we're talking about a strategy to meet the rated capacity and then for future expansion as well, what the consultant has recommended is starting with mechanical fine screens. And this will increase the performance of preliminary treatment and as well protect downstream processes. And while the screening doesn't address the flow constraints, it does improve the overall process. So to address the flow constraints, they're recommending, I guess, formalizing what's already a strategy that's available to us in terms of a peak flow equalization through the lagoon that's on site. And this prevents any oversizing of the headworks, and it increases the hydraulic capacity of the units. And this is done through the installation of a wet well, so a pumping station on site that would allow us to recall the flows from that equalization lagoon. So currently there are pipes that would allow the influent to go to the lagoon, but there is no fixed infrastructure that would then allow us to recall the influent back to the head of the plant, which is fine for a short-term strategy because we're able to treat the lagoon appropriately. But as flows increase and as we start to see more demands on the system, a more formal process such as this needs to be put in place. Next slide. So the consultants also looked at a biosolids handling strategy. And so the current issue at the plant is that we have high water content in the biosolids, which are stored in a separate holding pond. And to address this, the consultant has recommended, the consultant is still reviewing 3 different options and will make a recommendation here shortly. The options are to maintain the current operations, to install liquid storage tanks, and to install biosolids dewatering and cake storage. And this would be done through something called a rotary press, which is a fancy piece of equipment which removes liquid from the sludge. The consultant is conducting a net present value analysis on these three options to determine which is the most financially viable. Next slide. So some of the other priority projects for the Amherst plant. So electrical upgrades to the final effluent monitoring facility are required. And then the installation of VFDs on blowers, once again, to reduce energy usage. That's a common theme throughout many of our plants. Next slide. So moving into Bath, and once again, starting with the growth projections. So I'll start by noting on the left, the rated capacity of the plant at 3,000 meters cubed a day, and the green line representing that 80% mark. For the Bath sewage treatment projections, we are not anticipating to reach the actual flows of 80% until around 2041. And again, I'll note that gray band across the graph representing the CSC. So while we do have committed capacity above that 80% mark, we've met the MECP requirements through this exercise to plan for future expansion, but we're not anticipating it occurring anytime soon. Moving to the next slide. So once again, our consultant, RV Anderson, did a bottleneck analysis of the Bath sewage treatment plant to look at where any potential shortfalls are within the system. And for the Bath treatment plant, they identified sludge digestion as the only issue within the plant. So if we go to the next slide, the digestion strategy is primarily to haul excess sludge from Bath to Amherstview, as the Amherstview plant has excess capacity. And so it would be better use of our available assets to complete this. There's also a number of other alternatives that are available. We can look at using third parties to treat that sludge digestion as necessary. And so we're proposing to complete a trial run of this sludge hauling from the one plant to the other to see operationally how it impacts us and I guess verify the consultant's recommendations before we move forward with anything in a more permanent state. Next slide. So a few of the other priority projects coming out of the Bath sewage treatment plant are to improve the CSC flow metering, increase sampling to determine organic loadings from CSC. So when we talk about organic loadings, this is fats, oils, greases. So you'll hear the term fog used, and the fog can affect the capacity at the plant, as a heavy organic loading places a larger demand on the plant. So by reducing the fogs within the system, it can help improve the overall available capacity. And the last one is the installation of the VFDs on blowers to reduce energy usage. We are also recommending an analysis of a future system connection. So this would be looking at installing a pump station from Bath over to Amherstview, similar to what was done in Odessa, as Dave had mentioned, based on I think it was the 2004 master plan that they completed. This would be a much longer term strategy that we would look at, and we'd be completing an analysis to see what the capital costs are compared to the operational benefits that we would receive to see if it is a viable solution or not. Operationally, it is a lot simpler to only have one plant and add a new pumping station. But obviously there are large costs that would be associated with this that need to be evaluated further. Next slide. So sewage pumping stations. So when we're looking at the Bath sewage pumping stations, so each station was evaluated to determine what upgrades may be required. And so we have flagged Bath sewage pumping station number 1 for pump upgrades, but 2, 3, and 4, no upgrades are anticipated. And then if we're looking at the Amherst View and Odessa sewage pumping stations, so right now we are anticipating upgrades required for the Island View, Lakeview, and Taylor Kidd pumping stations. But at this time, none are anticipated for the Bridge Street pumping station. Industrial servicing. So when we're looking at industrial servicing, there's, I guess, three main components that we can discuss. The first being wastewater, the second being water for fire prevention and process use, and the third being potable water. So when we're looking at the Taylor Kidd Industrial Park, currently there is only potable water servicing available within there. So the township is not providing fire prevention as the flows are not available throughout the distribution system to that far of an extent. And as well, there is no wastewater servicing available throughout there. Dave would be able to provide more details. It has been looked at in the past, and ultimately it is a costly expansion to the system that at this time does not seem to provide any benefit based on those high costs. The other note there is when we're talking about industrial capacity, we will be coming with a capacity allocation policy to council. And so industrial capacity allocation is an important piece of that. So if we look at the next slide, it's looking at an analysis of a heavy ICI user. So this is sort of a simulated analysis that shows what happens if a new ICI user comes in that asks for 300 meters cubed per day of water capacity from the Fairfield system. So you can see that jump in 2021 is that simulated user, which ultimately causes that 80% threshold to occur 5 years earlier in the process. And we would be closing in on the rated capacity of the plant by 2046. Next slide. So again, this is just looking at the heavy ICI user scenario and doing a comparison of side by side to see how that impacts the ultimate flows within the plant. Next slide. Growth impacts for impost fees. So based on projections, large capital projects will be required for treatment plants and potable water storage near the end of the IMP planning period. So impost fee calculation should consider a longer term strategy to ensure these projects are accounted for as we move forward with that. And that's sanitary. Are there any questions?
Council, any questions on this item? Councillor Pratt.
Just a few through you, your worship. Luke, on page, I think it's page 24 on the report, it just says, and I just want to clarify what this means in my little head here. The plant, and it's talking about Amherst Water Pollution Control Plant. The plant has a rated capacity of 6,400 meters cubed per day with a peak flow capacity of 16,000 meters per day. What's the difference between the two?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. So the rated capacity is based on the average day flows. So that would be, your typical flows that result from your residential connections. The peak flow represents your inflow and infiltration within the system. So when you get a large storm event or have a wet year, you'll see spikes in your flows, and those are captured within the peak flow calculations. As well, peak flow also looks at some of the changes throughout the day. So, someone goes to work and then they come home, and then, if everyone's showering in the evening, you might get higher flows throughout the day at certain times. And so it's just accounting for those natural variations within the system as well.
So on one of those days where you have a peak, what happens with, I guess, I may be overthinking this, but so if the capacity is 6,400 and on a peak flow day you have 16,000, where does that overflow go? Is it in the system? Like is where does it go, I guess, or am I missing a point here somewhere?
Yeah, there is no overflow, so the system is designed to accommodate that. The difference is related to some of the bacteriological and chemical processes that are involved in a treatment plant. So while the treatment plant can absorb a peak flow of that for certain times, it wouldn't be able to sustain that for very long.
Okay, and just a couple more, Your Worship. The daily flow declining in those two charts in Amherst and Bath, is that just an aberration more than, I don't know what chart that was. It's one of the first ones you had up there. Even that one there, just the little decline there, is that sort of an aberration, or is it just more, maybe the infrastructure's been improved, we don't have leakage? Is that what that basically is showing?
Yeah, so when we're looking at sanitary, it's a focus on inflow and infiltration. So as infrastructure gets improved, you reduce that inflow and infiltration into the system. So I think Bath has a slight decline, whereas I think the Fairfield system that you're talking about, you would have seen a more dramatic spike in change. And so that represents infrastructure improvements that have been made.
Okay, and just one last one. I was quite amused by the term.
We were just comparing notes here, but two things. One is CSC has done some work in Bath over the last couple of years. I'm not sure where they're at myself, but maybe MJ knows. The other thing is it's a good observation because sewage flows are very dependent on just precipitation rates. So either prolonged wet periods have a big impact, or that major storm that overflows the ditches and that sort of thing. So we got to watch those numbers.
Okay, thank you.
And
Just the last point, I was quite amused by the terminology of cake. So I have a vision of this cake. Does this cake get transported off site? Like you were talking about maybe bringing sludge from Bath to Amherstview. Does that then go somewhere else? And just sort of another side to that, possible, maybe, I guess the scenario of maybe moving that sludge, would that be an internal thing where staff would do it, or would that be contracted out in a project at Bath, let's say?
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Mayor. So I guess to your first point, I guess the difference between sludge and cake. So sludge is a very liquid byproduct. And so it gets hauled in a liquid tanker. Whereas cake is the process that happens once you de-water the sludge through the technology we're primarily looking at is a rotary press. And so it reaches a certain percent of solids that's desired based on the design of the system. The best description for it would be like a cow patty, to be honest. The current process for handling sludge is done through a third-party contractor. Ultimately, I believe it gets field applied. I'm seeing nods back there. So it gets ultimately field applied primarily as a liquid product because that's what our byproduct is. The cake could still be field applied as well, but it would be done as a more solid product. From my experience in the city of Kingston, both of their sewage treatment plants and the major ones in the east and the west end, they produce a solid cake as well.
So maybe I could add a little bit. The advantage to this is you're not hauling water. So there's potentially some financial advantages in moving drier product than wet.
It may have changed, but I think the regulation for application of the cake versus the sludge on the fields is different as well. The cake used to be able to go on more, and I haven't looked at it in a few years, but it used to be the cake could go on where the sludge couldn't because you were putting on a dry product instead of a wet. But I'm not sure if that still stands.
The more recent regulation, it's really based on concentration,
Okay.
unloading on the land. So you're looking at how many grams, how many kilograms per acres that you can apply.
Okay.
Whether it's wet or dry, doesn't really matter. That's what they're looking at.
Probably updated since I was
Yeah.
reading it before. Thank you. Any other questions from council or comments? Seeing none, please carry on.
So I mentioned way back at the beginning that there was a miscellaneous one, and there's 4 projects as identified on these slides. Cybersecurity, looking at basically the water and sewage plant. There's a lot of issues have happened over the last decade or so in water and sewage plants, so it's an issue of concern. Loyalist does not have I'm going to call it an approved snow storage facility. There's been an informal one behind the roads garage that serviced wherever need to be hauled. The hauling has increased in certain years. This year wasn't as bad as we expect as last year, but the higher density residential developments are requiring more hauling, where before it was just Main Street, Odessa, Main Street, Bath were the kind of spots, maybe the odd intersection clearing. So we thought we'd be at a point in this process that we'd actually identify a site, but there's so many environmental constraints out there that we didn't feel like the dollars we would have had to spend to get a solution and get it fast. Really, we didn't think that was worthwhile, and take our time and make sure we got a good solution. So the recommendation is basically to keep looking for this site. Natural heritage, that's a kind of a new topic, but putting value on natural features. And if I use something, having large trees in urban areas and stop that summer heat so that people, elderly people aren't dying from heat exhaustion, or having a resilient wetland area so that when you get that big storm, there's a safe spot to get it. And our current formal asset management plan, like the provincial model, doesn't include that. There's a push on to recognize that these assets have some value. Another example we did ourselves is we did the constructed wetland for about $300,000 at Evershew, and that has saved the multi-million-dollar UV system that we put into Bath, and we don't have the $200,000 or $300,000 a year energy charge with it. It won't last forever. It has a certain capacity, but why it works, and it's free, just sunshine. Rural groundwater supply. For those of you who live in the rural area, this is no surprise, but Loyalist doesn't have any water in the country, in the countryside, very little. So our discussion is basically going to reinforce that if Loyalist is going to grow, it should be growing in fully serviced communities. And thank you for my part.
Okay, almost there. So basically as next steps, so from now until roughly the end of November, we will finalize all the background technical memorandums. I believe Dave mentioned we're probably about 95, 98% done at this point, but we just need to finalize a few things. And then complete the draft infrastructure master plan report. Then the expectation near the end of November is the next step, once we have a draft IMP report, is to issue a notice of completion of the infrastructure master plan, and that will start a 30-day mandatory public and agency review period, which includes also the indigenous communities. It will include a public meeting. So the public has a chance to provide further comments on the proposed priorities and projects. The Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks do get an additional 30-day review. So they have 60 days to review our report. And we will be working to obtain approval from the Ministry of Environment at the conclusion of that review report. So they may come back with you need to tweak this project, or this has not really been answered. So there's back and forth that happens. But once they've finished their period, they basically approve. It's a formal approval from the ministry. So we're aiming for the end of January. And then the plan will come back to council for adoption sometime in February 2024. So these timelines are what we are aiming for to cross the finish line for this project. But if in the finalization of draft report, we don't get information or anything is delayed, it pushes the finish line a little bit, because there is a 60-day period that, is not flexible. And yeah, I think that's it. Did I forget something?
So going back to Councillor Product's questions on Indigenous interaction, my thoughts are the only thing that could sort of slow things down once the MECP has done the review is if there's a formal Indigenous response, then that'll take a definite formal time to resolve. It's looking at what's happened out there. Otherwise, the general public really doesn't have, like, prior to 2022, the public could appeal. That public right of appeal was removed by the current government. So it's really, at the end of the day, it's council's decision. So.
Okay, thank you. So any final questions, comments? Councillor Broderick.
Through your worship, just two questions, and one may not have anything to do with the IMP in a sense. It had been mentioned, the Amherst Drive traffic study. Get a date for completion on that?
Um,
I don't know if it was formally. I don't know if it was formally called study, but just that was sort of mentioned as part of that.
Yeah, through you, the study has been completed. We've received that document. So we are currently reviewing it to look at what makes sense to implement and what the financial implications of that are. The hope is certainly to bring this before council sooner rather than later.
Through you again, your worship, just one more. In the final product, residents' comments, whether online or not, do we get access to that, or can we get a look at some of the comments that have been made, or is that part of the sort of the formal down the road?
I'm going to call it the final draft document that's submitted for review is required to include all of the comments, whether online, whether written submission. So there's quite an extensive, all our survey results will be there. So that all that stuff is available in the formal document. It may or may not be in the book just because it's. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments from council? Just checking, part of the recommendation tonight was for us to provide input. I know for myself, this evening was the learning curve for me as after reading the document. So without delaying the schedule or extending anything, we have a week or two if something comes to mind to forward it to staff for consideration.
So through your worship, you have more than a week or two, because until we really finalize the draft report, we would accept any comments, even through the public meeting portion as well. So we're here if you have thoughts on, there was a lot of information. So as it sinks in, if you have more thoughts or you want to see more information, different details, we can definitely, you just send me an email and then we will share that information.
Okay, thank you. And the supplementary slides, they're just for information, just examples of what was discussed this evening. Okay, just wanted to make sure that when we got to this stage, we were completing it. So if there's no further comments or questions, Councillor Broderick. well, we have to do the recommendation first. So I just wanted to thank staff for bringing this forward. There's a lot of work has gone into this. There is a lot of information to digest, and I found this evening very good. As I said, that was my educational process this evening. So that was very good. And it's great that I know we've got a team sitting here this evening, but everyone else was involved as well. As you said, it touched every department, and it also had the great, the asset of a lot of experience and Loyalist Township knowledge from Mr. Thompson as well, that I'm sure was extremely valuable when we were doing this, because I know he's a wealth of knowledge on anything Loyalist and before Loyalist. So with that, we have a recommendation that the report from the Economic Growth and Community Development Services Department, September 14th, 2023, redraft infrastructure master plan be received, and the council provides direction to staff and any project priorities to be incorporated into the final infrastructure master plan. Do I have a mover? Councillor Willis. So moved, seconded by Councillor Bubrick. Any comments from the mover, seconder?
Yes, just through you and as a reminder on that we've got some time to add in those priorities
Yes.
that are stated there. So just as a reminder that let's do our homework on this side.
Yes, for sure. Any other comments? Seeing none, call a question. All in favor? Motion is passed. Now I would entertain a motion to adjourn by Mr. Broderick and seconded by Councillor Parks. Call a question. All in favor? Motion is passed. We are adjourned at 9:30.